What if the most powerful people in history reeked? Behind the silk, beneath the crowns, British royalty hid a dirty little secret they didn't bathe. Not much, anyway. From festering monarchs to perfumed queens who feared soap more than scandal, these were rulers who ruled the world while smelling like a stable. Forget the fairy tale, this is the monarchy unwashed, unlaced, and unexpectedly gross. Welcome to 30 English royals with shockingly bad hygiene. You might want to hold your nose. Before we dive nose first into the royal funk, take a second to subscribe if you're into history that smells a little off. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? Let's see how many of us are wide awake and nose deep in royal grime. King John. There are villains you love to hate, and then there's King John, the kind of monarch who could clear a banquet hall without drawing his sword. Not because of treachery, though he had plenty of that. Not because of tyranny, though the Magna Carta would beg to differ. No, John had a simpler weapon of mass repulsion: himself. You could smell King John before you saw him. A walking affront to both personal hygiene and political stability, he's the only English king who managed to earn the nickname filthy in the medieval sense, as in physically repulsive. That wasn't a metaphor. Chroniclers were not reaching for poetic effect when they described the monarch as foul in body. They meant it literally: dirt under the nails, grease on the skin, sweat that no longer belonged to this century. Now, to be fair, 13th century hygiene was never going to win any awards. Medieval nobles bathed irregularly, perfumes stood in for soap, and dentistry was best described as aspirational. But even by the loose olfactory standards of the day, where you could host a feast without anyone noticing you hadn't washed in a week, John still managed to stand out. He didn't just avoid bathing. He treated it like an ideological position. This is the same man who, according to some accounts, thought diplomacy was best done shirtless, barefoot, and shrieking. And yet, somehow, his refusal to touch water was more offensive than his foreign policy. Visitors from continental courts found him appalling. Not scandalous, not outrageous, just disgusting. Ambassadors wrote home not with tales of courtly intrigue or majestic splendor, but with detailed complaints about the king's smell. One even implied that being near him too long was hazardous to one's garments. His fingernails were blackened, his teeth rotted to the point of visible decay, and his breath could be categorized as medieval chemical warfare. When his mouth opened, you didn't just wince, you prayed. It didn't help that John was a glutton. He devoured meat by the trenchers, gulped down wine like it owed him money, and seemed constitutionally opposed to vegetables. There are reports of him growing bloated and red-faced in his later years, and since exercise wasn't really his thing unless it involved hunting peasants or storming castles, the combination of poor diet and no hygiene turned his body into an ecosystem of unpleasant smells. And then there's the matter of his legendary paranoia. In his later reign, John grew suspicious of everyone: nobles, clerics, relatives, even his own servants. He locked himself away for days, sometimes weeks, surrounded only by the same stale food, the same sweat-soaked linens, the same filthy robes clinging to his skin. His court was like a crime scene, except the murder weapon was body odor and the victim was dignity. Even the chroniclers who hated him, and there were many, didn't try to excuse his habits as some kind of ascetic humility. They just wrote the truth. He stank. He was slimy. He was sticky to the touch. One monk described him as a man who lived in vice without shame, which could mean a lot of things, but in John's case, probably meant he smelled like a damp stable and didn't care who knew it. But perhaps the most damning detail comes from an unexpected source: his own teeth. By the time he was middle-aged, John's mouth had become a rotting ruin. His dental decay was so advanced that even in an era when blackened stumps passed for molars, his condition was considered notable. This wasn't just neglect, it was defiance. He had access to apothecaries, to herbal remedies, even to basic tooth-scraping instruments used by monks and barbers. But he chose, instead, to rot from the mouth outward. Ironically, this might be the most honest thing about him. A man so reviled, so untrustworthy, so slippery in reputation, and yet his body refused to lie. His breath told the truth. You didn't need a papal bull or a royal decree to know what kind of man you were dealing with. One whiff would do. And in the end, it was fitting that he died as he lived, bloated, sweating, and surrounded by a stench of his own making. Some say he succumbed to dysentery during a military retreat, but others suspect foul play. Either way, it didn't take long for the room to empty. A dead king smells worse than a live one, but in John's case, the difference was barely noticeable. And yet, for all his failings, the betrayals, the cruelty, the smell, John wasn't alone in his refusal to wash. His descendants would take up the unwashed crown with gusto, and the next in line, a king who liked digging ditches, sweating through his royal robes, and showing up to council looking like he'd just wrestled a pig in a thunderstorm. Edward II had ideas. None of them were clean. Edward II. If King John was a monarch marinated in his own filth, Edward II was a man who marched into grime with a kind of bizarre pride, like a prince who mistook the barnyard for a ballroom and never realized he'd made a wrong turn. Edward II didn't just ignore the rituals of royal grooming, he actively rejected them. At a time when kings were expected to present themselves as divine symbols of order, cleanliness, and courtly refinement, Edward seemed determined to prove that a man could wear a crown while looking like he'd just crawled out of a trench, and not metaphorically. Because here's the thing about Edward. He liked labour, manual labour, the kind with sweat, calluses, and grime. He took pleasure in mingling with common workers, ditch diggers, masons, and fishermen, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a lifestyle. He would drop his royal robes, roll up his sleeves, and dive headlong into the mud, dirt, and soot like it was a spa treatment. Except it wasn't fast. There was no hot stone massage. Just a monarch covered in sludge and perfectly fine with it. Contemporary nobles were horrified. The French court, notoriously judgmental on matters of presentation, sent envoys who returned in silent shock. The king, they whispered, was sweating beside peasants, shirtless. And worse, he didn't seem ashamed. He'd just saunter back to his palace, covered in soil and grime, tracking footprints across marble floors, and plop down in his chambers without even attempting to wash. This wasn't some rustic cosplay. It was his routine. And while working up a sweat with your subjects might sound noble in a modern political speech, in medieval England it was more or less the equivalent of showing up to church reeking of pigsty. This wasn't a time when kings were expected to be relatable. They were expected to be untouchable, ethereal, chosen by God, not splattered with cow dung and laughing about it. But Edward didn't care for expectations. Not political ones, not personal ones, and definitely not hygienic ones. Ambassadors complained of his unsightly and unclean appearance. He was known to show up late to council meetings, if at all still visibly dirty from his latest outdoor expedition. Clothes wrinkled, hair matted with sweat, hands blackened with dirt. Some said he had the look of a man permanently mid-construction, as if the king himself were a wall still being built. He kept animals close to his quarters, including his favourite, a herd of goats, and it's unclear whether this was due to affection or simply the shared smell. His grooming habits, or lack thereof, were legendary. Edward wasn't just resistant to bathing, he seemed to consider it an intrusion. Washing was for men who needed to impress someone. Edward's idea of refinement was probably wiping his hands on a slightly less filthy tunic. There are records suggesting that his servants were under specific instruction not to prepare baths unless expressly ordered. Spoiler, they were rarely ordered. But perhaps most disturbing of all, at least to his court, was how comfortable he was in his filth. There was no shame, no self-consciousness. Just a man who'd rather spend the afternoon hammering stones into a bridge than attending to his royal body. To Edward, the calluses were badges of honor, the sweat, a political statement, the stink. Well, let's say that if nobility was judged by aroma, Edward would have been dethroned immediately. And then there were the teeth. Dental care in the early 14th century was primitive, but not non-existent. There were herbal rinses, rough brushes made of bone or wood, and even early tooth powders. But Edward skipped them all. His fondness for dried fruits and ales combined with his aversion to oral hygiene meant that his breath was more punishment than presence. Courtiers would often keep their distance, bowing with exaggerated reverence mostly to avoid proximity. One chronicler wrote that the king was as careless with his body as he was with his crown, a biting remark from a man who had clearly been too close for too long. Another, more blunt, noted that Edward lived as a pig among princes. A bit much, perhaps, but if the shoe fits and it's covered in mud, Edward probably wore it for 3 weeks straight. Ironically, this total disregard for royal hygiene wasn't what ended him. His fall came from the usual culprits: political disaster, noble rebellion, and the general problem of being widely despised. But his filthiness played its part. It alienated his allies, offended his enemies, and made it exceedingly difficult to build alliances. After all, it's hard to command loyalty when your handshake leaves a smear. And so Edward faded, not with dignity, not with power, but likely still wearing the same sweat-drenched tunic he'd worn while digging ditches. But if you thought Edward's sweaty adventures were bad, just wait until you meet his descendant, a king known for his swagger, his charm, and his truly breathtaking ability to be both seductive and shockingly unwashed. Edward IV didn't sweat with peasants. He preferred to charm noblewomen, and then forget to bathe before dinner. If you're still with us after that, you're clearly built different, or at least royally curious. Go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't already, and while you're here, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Late night doomscroll in Dublin? Lunchtime escapism in Sydney? We want to know who else is nose first in royal history at this ungodly hour. Edward IV. Edward IV had the face of a storybook prince and the habits of a tavern mop. Tall, broad-shouldered, and famously handsome. He was the kind of man who could silence a hall simply by entering it and then unsilence it with the slow realization that something in the air had gone terribly wrong. Because, while Edward may have looked like the ideal medieval monarch on the outside, the inside and indeed the underarms told a different story. He was charming, yes, magnetic even. He won battles with flair and women with ease. Chroniclers praised his comeliness, his charisma, his confidence. But underneath that armor and charm was a man with a remarkably casual relationship with soap, fresh garments, or the concept of basic self-maintenance. To understand Edward IV's hygiene is to understand contradiction. Here was a king who loved luxury, feasts with spiced meats and sugared confections, rich silks embroidered in gold, chamber music, falconry, and courtly pageantry. He spent extravagantly, indulged frequently, and seemed to treat his body as a sort of medieval amusement park. But when it came to actual cleanliness, the royal investment ended abruptly. Edward was frequently described as slovenly, a word that didn't just mean casually dressed back then. It meant he looked like he had spent the night under a hay cart, rolled into court, and pretended nothing was wrong. He was known to wear the same robes for days, sometimes longer, even when they were visibly soiled. Bathing, he believed, weakened the body. That was a common superstition among the nobility at the time, that hot water opened the pores and let in illness. But Edward took that fear to heart like it was gospel. The fewer baths, the better. Instead, he relied on perfumes, powders, and according to some exasperated accounts, wishful thinking. One courtier recorded that, "The king delighteth in mirth, but attendeth little to his person," a diplomatic way of saying, he was funny, but he stank. The irony was almost too perfect. Here was a monarch with immense public appeal, a king who could rouse armies and woo nobles, who drew crowds just by walking down the street, and yet, up close, smelled like a man who hadn't walked near soap since Lent. He loved women, of course. His romantic escapades were legendary. Edward IV was, by all accounts, insatiable. But here's where the details get uncomfortable. Multiple mistresses reportedly complained about the king's reluctance to clean himself. He'd arrive in their chambers late at night, wearing the same doublet he'd worn hunting that morning, and proceed as though no one would notice. And they did. They noticed. Still, his good looks seemed to buy him a strange immunity. People forgave Edward things they wouldn't have forgiven in any other man. He was a king who could walk into a banquet looking like he'd wrestled a roast pig, and people would still describe him as regal. But behind the fanfare, behind the polished shields and velvet banners, there was always the lingering smell of sweat, mead, and months-old fabric. Even in battle, Edward was inconsistent. He was undeniably brave and often led his men directly into the fray, but instead of using military discipline as a reason to improve his hygiene, it became another excuse to avoid it. After all, if you're rolling around in armor, who needs to clean off afterward? Just throw on a new cloak. Or, more accurately, don't. Later in life, the problem worsened. Edward began gaining weight. His active lifestyle gave way to indulgent feasting, and his personal maintenance followed suit. Royal laundresses reportedly begged to dispose of his garments after certain banquets, rather than clean them. Servants developed the quiet art of sidestepping him in corridors. But Edward didn't seem to care, or perhaps he didn't notice. He had grown up in the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, a world of shifting alliances, sudden deaths, and makeshift coronations. Cleanliness was never the priority. Survival was, power was. And now, as king, he seemed to believe he could outcharm reality itself. He almost did. Edward's reign was surprisingly stable for a man whose life looked like a tavern brawl most of the time. People tolerated the smells, the stained clothes, the unwashed hair because the face was pretty, the voice was commanding, and the throne was solid. But history does not preserve odors, it preserves ironies. And the irony of Edward IV is this: the king who looked like a god lived like a stable hand. His reign glittered, but his habits did not. And as his life faded, so did his strength. Illness eventually caught up with him, some say pneumonia, others suspect complications from overindulgence. Whatever it was, the last days were not kind. He died younger than most expected, and perhaps, one last time, avoided a bath on the way out. But Edward's slippery grip on hygiene wouldn't die with him. His successor, a shrewd, skeletal, financially obsessed king, would bring a new level of discipline to the monarchy. A colder reign, yes, but not a cleaner one. Because Henry VII, despite his obsession with order and coin, had a mouth that could kill a conversation from across the throne room. Henry VII. Henry VII was not a man you hugged. Not because he was cruel, though he was, or because he lacked warmth, though he did, but because being within a foot of his mouth was reportedly a once-in-a-lifetime olfactory experience, and not the good kind. The kind that made you question whether your nose had ever truly suffered before. This was a king who built his dynasty from paranoia, silence, and receipts. He counted every coin twice, trusted no one, and viewed public affection the way most people view plagues. But for all his micromanaging and fiscal discipline, there was one area of his life that defied the rules, the books, and the bureaucratic oversight: his own face. More specifically, his teeth. To understand the hygiene of Henry VII is to study absence. Absence of cheer, absence of comfort, and most of all, absence of dental care. In an age when most mouths were health hazards at best and crime scenes at worst, Henry still managed to stand out. Foreign ambassadors mentioned it delicately, the way one might refer to an expired pheasant left under a throne. "The king's manner is grave," one wrote, "and his breath formidable. Diplomatic, yes, but the message was clear. Bring a handkerchief and pray you're upwind." It's not that Henry didn't understand hygiene. He was a methodical man. His court was clean, his financial records immaculate. He imposed order on everything: his nobles, his wardrobe, even the placement of tapestries. But when it came to his body, particularly his mouth, he seemed to ignore the chaos. He would sit for hours, scribbling in ledgers, while the unchecked rot beneath his crown quietly advanced like a taxless rebellion. The irony is exquisite. Here was a king who rose from exile to crush a nation of nobles, who reorganized the monarchy with surgeon-like precision, and who personally reviewed accounting ledgers for stolen bedsheets, and yet never managed to discover the benefits of rinsing. This wasn't mere medieval neglect. The 15th century was no golden age of toothpaste, but remedies did exist. There were rinses of sage and vinegar, pastes of crushed mint and salt, and even tooth-scraping implements made of silver and bone. But Henry, the man who never met a tax he didn't like, apparently saw dental care as an optional luxury, which is deeply ironic, considering he invented half a dozen new taxes and still wouldn't spend a penny on his gums. His courtiers noticed. They always notice. There's no escaping a monarch's proximity. Imagine leaning in to present a scroll and realizing you'd rather be thrown in the stocks than take another breath. Diplomats began strategizing their meetings around wind direction and conversational geometry. Angling slightly sideways became a survival tactic. And yet, Henry wasn't a slob. He wore crisp robes, polished rings, and meticulously folded linens. He was presentable, even elegant in a skeletal, slightly haunted way, but the mouth ruined it. It always did. There's something brutally democratic about breath no title can outclass a stench. His personal physicians didn't press the issue, not openly. Henry was not a man you corrected. He ruled through suspicion. He carried lists of names, people to monitor, to tax, to quietly ruin. Suggesting he brushed twice a day might have landed a man in debtor's prison. And so the silence lingered, as did the smell. But the mouth was only the beginning. Henry wasn't fond of bathing either. He bathed when necessary: ceremonial occasions, diplomatic visits, high feast days. But the in-between? Sparse. He preferred sponge baths, performed by servants with bowls of lukewarm water, in private. Water was feared in excess. It could weaken the body, invite disease, stir the humors in dangerous ways. So instead of full immersions, he opted for token gestures: a dab here, a cloth there. Scented oils and powders were employed, not to cleanse, but to mask, to distract, to hide what was never cleaned in the first place. And always the teeth. He'd smile rarely, but when he did, the room remembered. Even his portrait, stiff, cold, and cautious, seemed to hint at the problem. A tight mouth, unsmiling, lips pursed in a way that suggests either disapproval or damage control. You won't find a painting of Henry VII mid-laugh, probably for the best. Still, he got results. His rule was effective. He rebuilt the monarchy from the wreckage of civil war, filled the royal treasury to bursting, and laid the foundations for an infamous son. But he never managed to conquer himself. His body remained a quiet rebellion, one he never taxed, never tamed, and never cleaned properly. And that infamous son? He had more soap, more servants, more ointments, doctors, and advisors. But the cleanliness didn't stick, because Henry VIII didn't smell like neglect. He smelled like infection. Henry VIII is remembered for many things: 6 wives, 2 excommunications, the birth of the Church of England, and a temper that could take off a nobleman's head before breakfast. But there's one part of his legacy that history books politely sidestep: the king's profoundly unpleasant aroma. This was not the romantic courtly figure we see in paintings, the robust Tudor lion in a feathered hat and jewelled doublet, gazing sternly into the middle distance. That's propaganda. Real Henry, especially in his later years, was not a feast for the senses. He was a warning label. And the most tragic part? He had every tool to be clean. Wealth, physicians, apothecaries, herbs imported from Italy, attendants ready with silk towels and perfumed oils. Yet he consistently managed to smell like a man who thought washing was a French conspiracy. By the end of his reign, he had become a paradox in motion, obsessed with his image, indifferent to the reality it concealed. In his youth, he was athletic and dazzling tall, charismatic, fluent in multiple languages, musically gifted. But even then, Henry's court noted his aversion to regular bathing. He'd sweat through tournaments, feasts, and chase scenes through Hampton Court, and then retire to his chambers not for a bath, but for a change of shirt. Clean garments, yes. Clean skin, debatable. Bathing, to Henry, was ritual, not hygiene. He had ornate wooden tubs filled with warm water and lined with cloth to keep him comfortable, but they were reserved for grand occasions or when he wanted to make a show of relaxation. Routine cleaning was not his style. His body was maintained like a piece of military hardware, polished on the outside, rusting underneath. The real trouble began later in life, when everything about Henry expanded his waistline, his ego, his paranoia, and his personal upkeep became increasingly optional. He became what polite historians refer to as corpulent, and less polite courtiers whispered about as monstrous. But size wasn't the issue. The issue was that he did not scale his hygiene with his body. In the final years of his reign, Henry wore heavily padded garments to conceal his bulk. These thick layers trapped heat, sweat, and whatever else his body was producing. His clothes functioned less as fashion and more as insulation against cold weather, against political enemies, and unfortunately, against airflow. Accounts from foreign visitors began to shift. Instead of praising his regal bearing or golden court, they noted his presence in a room. Not metaphorically, they meant scent. There were reports of aides opening windows discreetly before meetings, even in winter. Courtiers developed the skill of breathing without inhaling, a sort of diplomatic survival technique. And let's not ignore the irony. This was a king obsessed with appearance. He demanded perfect tapestries, commissioned elaborate portraits, and instituted dress codes at court. Yet the man beneath the ermine trim increasingly resembled an overripe fruit, glossy on the surface, deeply unfortunate inside. Henry's hygiene failures weren't limited to odour. He rarely cleaned his hands unless preparing for religious ceremony or receiving high-ranking guests. His fingernails, thick and poorly trimmed, left small scratches on scrolls he handled, like signatures of neglect. Meals were eaten by hand. Pies torn, meats gripped, sauces dripping down onto rings so valuable they could fund a minor rebellion. But instead of cleaning up afterward, Henry often wiped his hands on whatever cloth was nearest, which sometimes meant the royal tablecloth. And then there was his mouth. Henry had a legendary sweet tooth. Candied fruits, marzipan, sugared almonds, and flagons of spiced wine consumed daily and in quantities that would make a dentist weep. And while the Tudor court possessed primitive toothbrushes, usually sticks of aromatic wood or cloth wrapped around a finger, it's unclear if Henry used them consistently. His teeth darkened, his breath grew sour. But he never adjusted his habits. Perhaps no one dared suggest it. In fact, his personal physicians were more focused on managing his leg wounds, a painful, chronic condition he loathed discussing, than advising him to rinse. And so, his oral neglect continued unchallenged. But the most unsettling aspect of Henry's hygiene was how little it seemed to bother him. He walked the palace halls like a man immune to the rules of scent, proximity, or social consequences. He could order your execution, then lean in and speak close enough to make you dizzy, all with absolute confidence. Power, it seems, can mask almost anything. When he died in 1547, the nation mourned the king. It thought it knew the great reformer, the Lion of England, the father of a dynasty. But those who had stood too close likely felt something more complicated. Relief, perhaps, or the kind of quiet exhale one gives after surviving a storm. And yet, as the court turned the page on Henry's reign, they did not turn the page on bad hygiene. The next monarch would take the throne with a pious heart and a martyr's resolve, but she would also take it with unwashed garments, uncombed hair, and a smell that trailed her like a ghost. Mary, I did not just rule with fire. She ruled with musk. Mary. I ruled like a woman who knew the kingdom owed her something. Its loyalty, its penance, its fear. What it did not owe her, apparently, was soap. She entered the world as the long-suffering daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, neglected, humiliated, and politically sidelined for most of her life. When she finally took the throne in 1553, she didn't just rule England, she judged it. The court, the nobles, the Protestants, the servants, all under scrutiny. But there was one subject she didn't scrutinize nearly enough, herself. And not in a metaphorical, introspective sense. We're talking literally her body, her grooming, her laundry, all of it. Mary Tudor was not a woman for vanity. She wore grief like a second skin and austerity like a badge. Her wardrobe was severe, her expressions dour, and her household rigidly controlled. But buried beneath that cold dignity was a far less majestic truth. Mary avoided bathing to the point of concern. Reports from her own ladies-in-waiting paint the picture delicately, as courtiers always do. They speak of her modesty and her chaste routine. What they mean is this: the queen rarely washed. She wore the same undergarments for days, sometimes weeks, and seemed unfazed by the accumulation of body odor, dirt, and hair left unattended. This wasn't merely personal preference, it was a worldview. Mary had grown up deeply Catholic, surrounded by a culture that equated cleanliness with vanity and vanity with sin. The body, in her theology, was not to be pampered, it was to be endured. To indulge in perfume or excessive bathing was to flirt with pride. So she didn't flirt, she resisted. With grim, humid determination. One Spanish diplomat who had once championed her cause at court later confided that Mary's presence was difficult. Another remarked that her chambers were quiet but oppressive. which could easily have referred to both the atmosphere and the air quality. The Queen's ladies reportedly burned candles constantly, not just for piety, but to help counteract the smell that lingered in her rooms. There were attempts, cautious ones, to improve the situation. Physicians recommended herbal baths. Lavender sachets were placed in her closets. But Mary was resolute. She believed that her suffering was holy, that her discomfort was righteous. A hot bath could not compete with divine purpose, and so the scent of sanctity became unmistakably musty. This approach extended to her hair, which she rarely washed. In an era without dry shampoo or salon scheduling, this led to the predictable buildup of oils and debris. Combing helped, but only to a point. Over time, her once auburn locks darkened into lifeless strands, pinned tightly beneath veils and coifs. She wasn't hiding her hair for modesty alone, she was hiding what it had become. The garments she favored were heavy, dark, and worn repeatedly. Like her father, she distrusted change. Fresh clothes were seen as indulgent. Instead, she wore her gowns into the ground, and then had them mended, relined, and worn again. Laundering was minimal. Scented waters were dabbed around the neckline and cuffs, but the fabric beneath remained untouched. In close quarters, the result was memorable. And yet, despite all this, Mary never seemed embarrassed. That's the most striking part. She walked into court like a living sermon, solemn, pale, and unscented, and expected everyone else to adjust. She wasn't trying to impress, she was trying to endure, and she expected you to do the same. But her court was not composed of saints. Ambassadors, courtiers, and noble visitors found her personal habits hard to ignore. Rumours spread quietly, carefully, that the Queen's chambers were not fit for long audiences, that the air grew heavy after a time, that no incense could quite compete with what lingered on the Queen's gowns. These weren't just idle whispers. They had diplomatic consequences. Foreign suitors hesitated. Royal matchmaking stalled. Her own husband, Philip of Spain, while dutiful in public, reportedly limited his time with her in private. Their marriage was cold, but not just emotionally. Even as Mary waged religious war on her subjects, burning heretics, silencing dissent, and purging the Protestant elite, her own body waged its quiet rebellion. And while historians debate the politics of her reign, fewer explore its pungent subtext, that power, when paired with self-denial, can become profoundly difficult to stand near. Mary's legacy is scorched into England's religious memory, but the lesser-known truth is that she ruled in a cloud of her own conviction, dense, immovable, and scented like penance. When she died, the court moved swiftly to cleanse not just the policies, but the rooms themselves. Windows were thrown open, drapes were replaced, her gowns were burned. But England's air didn't stay clean for long. Her successor, Elizabeth I, was radiant, commanding, and cunning. She also famously bathed only once a month, whether she needed it or not. And she usually did. Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I ruled an empire, redefined queenship, and weaponized wit with the ease of a natural-born tactician. She was brilliant, theatrical, calculating, a monarch who understood the value of spectacle and the illusion of control. But behind the glorious tapestries, the powdered face, and the orchestration of an entire cult of personality, was a woman who bathed once a month, allegedly, and only whether she needed it or not. That quote, often repeated and always met with a nervous chuckle, wasn't a joke. Elizabeth herself is believed to have said it, perhaps with a smirk, perhaps with conviction. The ambiguity is perfect, a metaphor for her entire reign. You never quite knew where the mask ended and the monarch began. But even the most carefully constructed persona couldn't completely smother the scent of stubborn habits. Elizabeth's approach to hygiene wasn't unusual for the time, which is exactly the problem. For someone so ahead of her era in politics, propaganda, and survival, she remained decidedly behind when it came to personal upkeep. She was, in many ways, still her father's daughter, elaborate on the outside, unwashed underneath. The Virgin Queen curated every inch of her image. She draped herself in symbolism, pearls for purity, white gowns for chastity, crimson for power. Her face was powdered into an alabaster mask, lips stained crimson, her hair styled like a crown of flames. And yet, beneath those layers, the reality was not so pristine. Elizabeth's aversion to bathing, especially in her later years, became something of a silent ordeal for those around her. A typical Elizabethan bath, if and when it occurred, involved a wooden tub, sometimes padded with cloth, filled with scented water, warmed by fire. Attendants would carry jugs back and forth for hours. It was a production, and Elizabeth, ever concerned with time, energy, and preserving her majesty, decided the whole process was unnecessary more often than not. She preferred linen cloth soaked in rose water to clean herself gently dabbed, not scrubbed. These perfumed sponge baths were meant to freshen the skin without risking exposure to water, which many still believed could imbalance the humours and invite illness. Elizabeth wasn't about to take medical chances, not after a lifetime spent dodging assassination attempts, political plots, and the occasional rebellious cousin. But perfume only does so much, especially when it's covering layers of face paint that weren't removed daily but reapplied. The famed Venetian ceruse, the white lead paste she used on her skin, was toxic, clinging, and notoriously difficult to wash off. Instead of cleaning her face each day, Elizabeth often just added another layer. Over time, it built up like chalk on a blackboard, pristine at a distance, but up close, alarmingly textured. Those closest to her, especially her ladies-in-waiting, began to notice. The Queen's skin deteriorated with age, not just from the lead, but from the lack of proper washing. Her complexion, once described as fair and shining, became blotched and brittle. Her teeth, like many of her era, began to blacken, the result of a rich diet and little dental care. Her love of sweets didn't help. Neither did the stubborn pride that prevented anyone from suggesting she floss. And yet, Elizabeth insisted on being seen, daily, in court, in private meetings, in public processions. She appeared before her subjects with theatrical grandeur, arms outstretched, hair shining with saffron, and pearls projecting divinity, even as her physical condition quietly decayed. It was a masterclass in illusion, and it worked. To most, she was immortal, a goddess, glorious, but to those within close orbit, she was something more human and more difficult to ignore. Her gowns, rich and resplendent, were rarely washed. Instead, they were brushed down, dusted with powder, and aired out. Embroidery doesn't clean easily. Neither does velvet soaked with rose water and 3 weeks of royal wear. Her attendants were discreet. They had to be. You didn't survive in Elizabeth's court by commenting on the Queen's smell. You survived by keeping your nose down literally and politically. And still, she ruled. She held onto the throne with a grip that defied nature. While others rotted, she glittered. While noblemen decayed, she dazzled. She outlived them, outmaneuvered them, and outperformed them. But behind the white mask and the embroidered gloves was a monarch stubbornly stuck in her ways, a walking contradiction who used her own decay as a tool of statecraft. A queen who could dazzle a nation, but couldn't be bothered to bathe more than 12 times a year. When Elizabeth died, England trembled not just at the loss of a monarch, but at the loss of an era that had been stitched together by charisma, terror, and very strong perfume. And then, in her place, came a man who had all the royal presence of a cold stew. James I. King, whose smell could make Elizabeth's chambermaids nostalgic. A man whose fingernails had never met a blade they liked. A scholar, a drinker, and quite possibly the only monarch who made the concept of hand-washing feel controversial. James I. James I entered England like a nervous uncle crashing a royal masquerade, underdressed, overfamiliar, and followed by a smell that seemed both curious and curiously persistent. He was the first of the Stuarts to sit on the English throne, and what he brought with him from Scotland was more than a crown and a peculiar accent. He brought a personal philosophy that could best be described as radically indifferent to hygiene. Where Elizabeth I ruled with artifice, ritual, and a powdered veil of spectacle, James ruled with ink-stained fingers, greasy doublets, and a smell that once prompted a French ambassador to shorten his visit allegedly for health reasons. Born in 1566, James had endured a troubled, suspicious upbringing. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was deposed when he was just a baby. He spent most of his youth surrounded by austere Calvinist tutors, border tensions, and Scottish chill. Perhaps it was that Protestant severity that shaped his relationship with cleanliness, which is to say, he didn't have one. James was a thinker, a writer, a theological debater and obsessive pamphlet drafter. He believed himself to be divinely chosen and intellectually unmatchable. But despite all that cerebral elegance, his body told another story, one of stubborn filth and neglected grooming. His court quickly learned that the new king's version of royal grace included a dishevelled appearance, chronically untrimmed fingernails, and a body that radiated the distinctive musk of a man who believed soap was for cowards. Accounts from his own courtiers are both diplomatic and damning. One famously described him as unkempt in body and careless in appearance, which translated into less forgiving terms meant the king looked and smelled like he'd just lost a fistfight with a chimney. It wasn't that James was too busy to bathe. He simply refused to do so. Bathing, he declared, was dangerous to the health. Water, he believed, could infiltrate the body through the pores and weaken the constitution. And so he avoided it entirely. He preferred dry cloths, layers of heavy garments, and, in colder seasons, the comfort of natural body heat trapped neatly beneath several weeks' worth of unwashed fabric. The results were predictable. Visitors described his odor as strong, persistent, and in one especially brave letter, defensive. James did not walk into a room. He arrived in it, surrounded by a cloud of academic musings, tobacco smoke, and whatever had been fermenting in his sleeves. Tobacco was one of his few true indulgences, and he smoked constantly, even while railing publicly against the practice. He wrote an entire treatise titled A Counterblast to Tobacco, decrying its filth and foolishness, all while reeking of the very habit he condemned. He saw the act as uncivilized, but the taste as tolerable, a contradiction that defined much of his reign. And, conveniently, the smell of smoke helped mask more organic aromas. Then there were his fingernails, a subject so specific and so universally noted by foreign dignitaries that it practically became part of his diplomatic resume. James never trimmed them. He grew them long, yellowed, and ragged, fidgeting with them constantly during conversations. They were, he claimed, his natural quill's tools for thought. While others inked parchment, James scratched his scalp with the sharp edge of an index finger. A show of intellect, a showcase of grime. It's hard to overstate how out of place he looked in the glittering English court. Elizabeth had maintained a regime of control and illusion. Her court smelled of incense and powder. James's smelled of sweat, smoke, and old books. Gone were the choreographed pageants, replaced by half-drunken lectures on divine right and a monarch who greeted visiting ambassadors with garlic on his breath and yesterday's robe still hanging from his shoulders. And yet, he was not entirely unpopular. James had a dry wit, a fondness for dogs, and a taste for philosophical tangents that some found endearing. His court may have wrinkled their noses, but they couldn't deny that beneath the layers of dirt and negligence was a formidable mind one wrapped, unfortunately, in yesterday's linens. Still, not everyone was so forgiving. His queen, Anne of Denmark, maintained her own separate apartments. Whether this was out of protocol, preference, or self-preservation is left to speculation. What is certain, however, is that Anne had her own hygiene issues, particularly with her teeth, which began to rot early and gave her a breath that could level conversation. It seems that in the Stuart household, love may have been blind, but it certainly wasn't olfactory. If James was the king of intellectual grime, Anne was the queen of quiet decay, a royal couple united not just by marriage, but by a shared indifference to the nose. Anne of Denmark, queen consort of James I, was born into elegance, raised among grandeur, and married into chaos. Hers was a life wrapped in courtly splendor, rich fabrics, and ritual, the kind of existence where appearances were everything, and subtlety was a daily necessity. But there was one aspect of Anne's life that not even diamonds could dazzle away: her breath. From all outward signs, Anne was the consummate royal consort. She knew how to pose, how to glide, how to smile in a way that suggested grace without revealing too much. Her portraits depict her as the ideal Renaissance queen, poised, distant, luminous. But behind the painted lips and stiff ruffs was a chronic dental problem so severe that foreign diplomats made polite excuses to stand farther back than was customary. Anne's teeth began to rot early in life, likely due to a combination of genetic predisposition, poor dental hygiene, and a courtly diet heavy in sugar and exotic indulgence for the elite, and a death sentence for anyone's molars. Unlike her husband, who actively rejected cleanliness as a matter of personal doctrine, Anne's decline was subtler. She maintained the look of royalty, the elaborate gowns, the intricate hairstyles, the carefully arranged posture. But the mouth was another matter entirely. Records suggest that by her 30s, Anne's teeth were visibly deteriorating. Discoloration, decay, and the unmistakable scent of untreated dental disease began to creep into her interactions. In an age without modern dentistry, this wasn't entirely unusual. What set Anne apart was the degree of neglect and the unwillingness or inability to mask it effectively. She attempted the usual remedies of the time. Herbs, like mint and sage, were chewed or steeped to make rinses. Honey was mixed with vinegar in the hope of freshening breath. Even crushed pearls, yes, actual pearls, were occasionally rubbed on the teeth in a vain effort to polish away the decay. But these treatments were largely symbolic. They soothed the royal conscience more than the royal gums. The true toll was social. Anne's court became known not just for its opulence, but for its evasive choreography. Courtiers developed subtle tricks to avoid standing directly in her line of breath. Fan positions were adjusted. Seating arrangements were quietly rebalanced. The Queen was treated with the utmost respect, but always from a strategic distance. Her closest ladies-in-waiting, bound by duty and decorum, suffered in silence. It was a daily test of loyalty, to nod graciously while inhaling as little as possible. Whispered jokes circulated behind velvet curtains, but they never reached Anne's ears. One didn't laugh at the Queen, one simply learned to breathe differently. And yet, Anne herself seemed either unaware or unbothered by the problem. Her attention remained fixed on the theatre of monarchy. She was a patron of the arts, commissioning masks, paintings, and architecture that reflected her vision of nobility. She immersed herself in pageantry and aesthetics, a world where beauty could be composed, arranged, and perfected. But some things could not be staged. As her condition worsened, Anne withdrew more from public life. Her correspondence thinned. Her presence at court events became more selective. Illness played a role. She suffered from a variety of health issues in her later years, but her physical state, particularly her mouth, seemed to cast a long shadow over her remaining social appearances. Foreign ambassadors noticed. One Danish envoy, who had once praised Anne as radiant and splendid, wrote in a later dispatch that her health had faded visibly and her countenance was diminished. Carefully chosen words. Royal code for, she looked fine until she opened her mouth. And yet, James I, grimy, eccentric, and blunt, remained oddly attached to her. Their marriage was not a passionate one, but there was a sense of shared weariness between them. They understood each other in a way that didn't require close contact, or, perhaps, made close contact deliberately avoidable. When Anne died in 1619, at the relatively young age of 44, the court mourned her with all the proper rituals. Bells rang, black cloth was draped, and eulogies were delivered with practiced sorrow. But behind the pageantry, her legacy was quietly complicated, remembered not just for her contributions to the arts or her diplomatic poise, but for the small, constant detail that followed her everywhere she went. Anne had all the trappings of royal grace, but none of the breadth to match. Her husband's successor, their son Charles I, would carry himself with far more refinement, sharp clothes, a clean beard, and a serious face that rarely cracked a smile. But did he bathe? Let's just say the Stuart family resemblance wasn't purely genetic. Charles I is often remembered as the tragic king. Refined, soft-spoken, slightly aloof, and destined for the chopping block. But before the executioner's axe, before the Civil War, and before the endless portraits of a forlorn man looking wistfully into the distance, Charles was something far less poetic, a man with a strained relationship to cleanliness. Not as brazenly filthy as his father James I, and certainly more composed than his mother Anne of Denmark, but still, in his own soft-spoken, silk-wrapped way, quietly rancid. To look at him was to be misled. Charles had an immaculate sense of fashion. His clothes were always sharp, tailored, and meticulously coordinated. He preferred black and white with subtle accents, restrained elegance, never flashy. He presented himself as the image of majesty, stately, composed, untouchable. His beard was trimmed with monastic care. His posture was upright, almost theatrical in its poise. To the untrained eye, he appeared cleaner than virtue itself. But appearances, as ever in royal circles, were only skin deep. And even the best skin, when left unwashed, eventually reveals the truth. Charles came of age in a court that still whispered about his father's stench and his mother's breath. He seemed determined to correct for both. He cultivated silence, grace, and solemnity. But not hygiene. Not really. He bathed irregularly, like most nobles of the time, and often wore the same undergarments for days, if not longer, beneath his ornate outerwear. While he was more cautious than James I, and more self-aware than Anne, Charles still fell squarely within the Stuart tradition of royal self-neglect. It was a quieter kind of uncleanliness. He didn't smell like mud or pipe smoke. He smelled like expensive fabric worn too long in a closed room, like lace that had absorbed one too many royal sighs. His body odor wasn't weaponized like Henry VIII's or King John's. It was subtle, creeping, and melancholic, like an old library with one window that never opens. Eyewitnesses from court noted that Charles would often retreat to his private chambers for hours at a time, only to re-emerge wearing the same doublet, slightly wrinkled and oddly musty. His attendants would do their best brushing down his garments, adjusting cuffs, smoothing frills, but there's only so much brushing can do when the garment has lived a full life under royal arms. He avoided full baths, citing the common belief of the time. Water could weaken the spirits. Instead, he relied on scented cloths and the occasional sponge wash. These were done in private, far from the public eye, often by candlelight and in total silence. The act was not a cleansing ritual, it was a necessary nuisance. Charles's aversion to bathing was partly philosophical. He saw his body not as something to be maintained, but as something to be hidden, a vessel for royal authority, not for comfort. He feared illness, and like many in his court, believed that water might open the pores to unseen poisons. Better to sweat, suffer, and perfume over the problem than risk death by warm water. His physicians weren't thrilled. They advised more regular washing, especially during outbreaks of illness, but Charles remained skeptical. He would listen politely, nod, and then ignore them entirely. His grooming habits were, however, a cut above his family's bane. He did trim his nails. He kept his beard orderly. He even brushed his hair, a small victory in a dynasty where combs had been optional. But cleanliness is not the sum of small gestures. It's a habit, and Charles never quite formed it. Travel didn't help. During his royal progresses, where the king and his entourage moved across the countryside, Charles often stayed in old, damp castles with minimal facilities. The bedding was stale, the linens reused, the air thick, and in these moments, his personal hygiene declined further. Changing clothes became infrequent. Washing was reduced to a cold bowl and a damp rag. Yet, he still emerged each morning fully dressed, lace collar stiff, expression unreadable, like a man determined to hold court over his own decline. His queen, Henrietta Maria of France, reportedly found his habits difficult. While their marriage began with diplomatic tension and religious difference, it was the mundane reality of living with Charles. The smells, the silences, the unwashed linens that wore thin over time. She was raised in a French court that, while not much cleaner, at least pretended to be. Charles didn't even pretend. He simply carried on. And then, the war came. The English Civil War shattered his court, stripped away his rituals, and left Charles vulnerable. But even in captivity, he kept his old habits. Attendants recorded that he still refused full baths, even when they were offered. He would clean his hands, his face, perhaps his feet, but never fully. As if to say, even if you strip me of my crown, you will not strip me of my discomfort. When the end came, it was clean, but only in the political sense. Charles stepped onto the scaffold in 1649 with grace and dignity. His clothes were pristine, chosen carefully to avoid shivering not out of vanity, but to show resolve. His hair was tied back, his face composed. He looked for once like the image in the painting, noble, tragic, untouched by filth or fear. But it was just that, an image. And as the curtain fell on Charles's reign, the next act would open with his son, Charles II, a man who would return from exile with a dazzling smile, 1,000 mistresses, and the oily, lingering scent of someone who bathed about as often as he told the truth. Charles II. Charles II came back to England in a thunderclap of wigs, wine, and women, and very little in the way of soap. After over a decade of Puritan austerity and civil war, the monarchy had returned, and with it came what people thought was going to be elegance, refinement, and a refreshing change in royal hygiene. Instead, what they got was Charles, charming, clever, scandalous, and, according to multiple contemporaries, unmistakably oily and stinking. Known as the Merry Monarch, Charles had every reason to laugh. He was restored to the throne in 1660 after years in exile, returned to a kingdom that missed its old sins, and found himself surrounded by a court desperate to drink, dance, and forget the previous 2 decades. But while Charles excelled at theatrics and merriment, he had one glaring weakness. Cleanliness was not on his list of royal virtues. Despite an unusually keen awareness of public image, Charles maintained a surprisingly lax approach to his own grooming. Yes, he loved fashion. Yes, he adored drama and theatrical presentation. But washing himself, that was another matter entirely. In an era that was just beginning to flirt with Enlightenment ideas about hygiene, Charles remained stuck in the same unwashed lineage as his Stuart predecessors, a dynasty that at this point could be charted not just through bloodlines, but through body odor. Descriptions from courtiers, diplomats, and servants paint a picture of a king who was striking and magnetic, at a distance tall, dark-eyed, animated, but increasingly unappealing up close. His skin was often described as greasy. His signature long, black curly wigs, fashionable and expensive, were not always clean. In fact, they seemed to absorb his natural oils and carry them like royal relics. A few unlucky attendees mentioned the moisture that clung to the fabric of his collars and cuffs. Others were less diplomatic. One French envoy referred to him as animated grease in velvet. This wasn't just an occasional lapse. Charles developed a reputation for appearing unbathed, even at official events. He was known to sweat heavily, particularly during long court sessions or banquets. Combine this with the thick brocade garments, perfumed but rarely cleaned, and you've got yourself a mobile ecosystem of Tudor traditions and Restoration-era negligence. Now, you might think, well, the king was busy. War, politics, religious tension, assassination plots, maybe cleanliness, just didn't make the cut. But Charles was capable of prioritizing things. He curated his image carefully. He commissioned flattering portraits, hosted dazzling court performances, and was remarkably aware of how to manipulate public sentiment. The problem wasn't that he didn't understand the importance of appearances, it was that he believed cleanliness could be faked. He relied on perfumes, he relied on changing clothes. He relied, most of all, on charm. And charm, in fairness, was his most effective deodorant. Charles II was magnetic. People wanted to be near him, even when they didn't want to breathe near him. He had a quick wit, an easy manner, and a sense of timing that bordered on theatrical genius. He could insult you in a way that made you laugh and flatter you in a way that made you suspicious. His court became infamous for its decadence, gambling, feasting, gossip, and its distinct lack of boundaries. His many mistresses, ranging from actresses to noblewomen, tolerated more than just his affairs. Several of them made discreet complaints about the king's body odor, but it was quietly accepted as part of the royal package. And, of course, none dared voice it publicly. He was the king. He was also the man who could ruin your family name with a wink. Contemporary physicians, some of whom were beginning to promote more progressive ideas about sanitation, reportedly advised Charles to wash more often. There are references to aromatic baths prepared for him often left untouched. He preferred his own routine, a quick wipe down with cloth, a liberal application of cologne, and fresh clothes. Fresh, in this case, meaning different, not necessarily clean. There's also evidence that Charles used various powders not just for scent, but to reduce visible greasiness on his face and scalp. His attendants, familiar with the royal schedule, developed methods of refreshing him mid-event without the inconvenience of a full wash. A splash of rose water here, a dusting of powder there. The illusion of freshness maintained at arm's length. And still, He got away with it. He danced, he seduced, he ruled. But beneath the glamour, there was always the persistent truth that Charles II may have restored the monarchy, but he did not restore its cleanliness. In many ways, he amplified its scent, a blend of indulgence, laziness, and defiance, wrapped in velvet and laughter. When he died in 1685, his physicians performed an autopsy and found a body worn down by stress, illness, and a lifetime of unchecked habits. The court went into mourning, candles were lit, portraits were draped, but behind closed doors, some of his attendants may have breathed a quiet sigh of relief. The merry monarch was finally at rest, and so was his odour. His successor, James II, would prove less merry and far less magnetic. But as for Hygiene, let's just say he managed to be forgettable in every way except the smell. James II. James II was a man who wanted to be taken seriously, and in some ways, that's exactly what made his filth harder to forgive. He didn't have the charm of Charles II, the tragic aura of Charles I, or even the eccentric scholar's mystique of James I. He had sternness, he had stubbornness, and he had a lingering air of mustiness that made people instinctively take a step back when he entered a room. Unlike his older brother Charles, James didn't hide behind flamboyance. There were no glitzy court masks or dazzling public charm offensives. His rule was all hard edges, doctrinal proclamations, military formality, and awkward attempts at religious realignment. But even in the realm of physical presence, he lacked polish. In fact, he lacked soap. James's hygiene wasn't theatrical like Charles's. It was just sloppy. The kind of sloppiness that made his own courtiers whisper, "That robe again?" as he walked by. The kind that made ambassadors write cautious notes home, not about politics, but about the king's inexplicably unwashed hair and clothing that bore the creases and stains of multiple outings. He had the particular look of someone who didn't quite grasp the social consequences of skipping a bath, nor care to find out. James was militarily trained, detail-focused in matters of protocol, and quite good at following a chain of command. But in matters of personal maintenance, he had the blind spots of a man who confused rank with cleanliness. One chronicler from the time described him as greasy and sullen in appearance, which, even in an era of lenient hygiene standards, was not a compliment. Greasy, in 17th century terms, meant your natural oils had built a lasting alliance with your wig, and sullen meant people noticed, but no one dared say it to your face. The court had grown used to kings who stank, but James brought a different flavour of unwashed leadership. He was defensive, rigid, and frankly a bit sour emotionally and olfactorily. He rarely changed clothes when not in public view, reportedly wore garments multiple days in a row, and had a habit of appearing at informal gatherings in various stages of dishevelment. It was said that his valet had two jobs: maintaining the royal wardrobe and coming up with polite excuses for why the king would not be receiving visitors in close quarters that day. His grooming habits, or lack thereof, stood in stark contrast to the increasingly image-conscious expectations of European monarchs. The French court under Louis XIV had transformed Versailles into a theatre of scent, style, and social manipulation. Louis bathed rarely, yes, but he compensated with overwhelming perfumes and meticulous tailoring. James, by comparison, smelled more like someone who meant to wash and never got around to it every day, for years. His aversion to bathing wasn't ideological like his father's well, nor was it a strategic theatrical choice, as with Charles II. It was simpler. James didn't care. He found cleanliness time-consuming and unnecessary. His advisors urged him to adopt better grooming habits, especially when dealing with foreign envoys. He nodded and ignored them. The problem intensified with his embrace of Catholicism. A deeply unpopular choice in Protestant England, and a major contributor to his eventual downfall, Protestant pamphleteers had a field day. They couldn't resist connecting his foreign religion to his foreign odour. Satirists described him as reeking of Rome. Cartoons depicted him with clouds of filth swirling behind his robes, a literal smear campaign that wasn't entirely metaphorical. Even among supporters, the consensus was that James's appearance undermined his credibility. You can preach divine right all you want, but if your shirt collar is stained and your hair looks like it slept standing up, people notice. They don't always listen. In his personal quarters, the scent of damp fabric and stale air reportedly clung to the curtains. He rarely ordered full cleanings of his chambers, and servants were often reluctant to speak openly about it. One foreign diplomat remarked in a confidential letter that the king's private rooms had the ambience of a monastery left to neglect. His wife, Mary of Modena, was a polished and graceful presence, elegant in the French style, attentive to etiquette. Her proximity only made his slovenliness more noticeable. At state functions, the contrast between them became a running theme among courtiers. One, gliding, scented, and poised. The other, James. Eventually, James II lost more than just favour. He lost the crown itself. When William of Orange invaded, the Glorious Revolution swept him aside with remarkable ease. There were many reasons: politics, religion, legitimacy. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was also the accumulated weight of years of unwashed decisions. He fled into exile, not with the dignity of a fallen monarch, but with the clammy retreat of a man who had never quite fit the image of royalty or bothered to smell like it. But even exile has its echoes. His successor, Queen Anne, would inherit not just the throne, but the family tendency to avoid bathing. Only this time, the grime would meet gout, obesity, and the kind of sedentary suffering that no amount of rosewater could disguise. Queen Anne. Queen Anne reigned over the birth of Great Britain, the political unification of England and Scotland, the rise of party politics, and a new age of empire. But behind the grandeur of treaties and titles, she also reigned over something less frequently discussed: a deeply unpleasant personal atmosphere. Anne was a monarch of contrasts. She was both powerful and perpetually ailing, both queenly and crushingly insecure, and both surrounded by attendants, and somehow always alone. But perhaps her most persistent contradiction was the one between her stately court image and the private reality of a woman battling chronic illness, painful obesity, and hygiene practices that would have made a medieval monk flinch. Let's begin with the body. Anne suffered from a long list of medical issues, many of which were visible and olfactory by the time she took the throne in 1702. She experienced at least 17 pregnancies, most ending in miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death. These repeated traumas left her physically weakened and emotionally devastated. By her early 40s, she was morbidly obese, suffering from advanced gout, and largely immobile. The once active daughter of James II had become a monarch who could barely walk unaided and often had to be carried to meetings, church services, and council sessions. Bathing in that condition was more than difficult, it was nearly impossible. Traditional tubs were small, awkward, and required lifting in and out by servants. Anne avoided them entirely. There is no record of her taking full baths with any regularity after the first few years of her reign. Instead, she relied on sponge baths, light dabs with perfumed cloths administered by her ladies-in-waiting, often without much success. Her body, suffering from both inflammation and fluid retention, began to emit what was politely referred to as a sour odour. Contemporary sources are hesitant, but consistent. One courtier referred to the queen as having a lingering fragrance not unlike the kitchen's, which, given the lack of refrigeration in the early 1700s, was not meant kindly. Another wrote in a letter to his cousin that the queen's presence in a room could be sensed before it was seen, and not due to her reputation. Anne's chambers were said to be heavy with heat and scent. Her preference for thick curtains, upholstered furniture, and heavy woolen gowns created an environment where air rarely moved. Add to that her sedentary lifestyle and limited personal hygiene, and the result was a court that tiptoed, literally and diplomatically, around the issue. Her ladies-in-waiting, particularly those in her personal bedchamber, bore the brunt of it. These women, high-born, carefully selected, and politically connected, were often tasked with helping the queen change clothes, apply perfume, and conduct her daily sponge routines. None ever spoke openly about the conditions, but diary entries suggest a near-religious application of lavender water, scented sachets, and citrus oils. One lady recorded that the queen prefers orange blossoms about her person, which can be interpreted either as a fashion note or a survival strategy. Anne's clothes added another layer of discomfort for both her and her court. She favoured dense fabrics with elaborate embroidery, long trains, and multiple underlayers. These outfits were beautiful, ceremonial, and heavy. But under all that velvet and satin was skin that rarely breathed, and garments that, despite being brushed and spritzed, were not regularly washed. The technology to clean these elaborate pieces without ruining them simply didn't exist, so they were worn over and over and stored between uses in closets perfumed more out of necessity than luxury. Then came the physical symptoms. Anne's gout caused constant swelling in her legs and feet. Her joints were inflamed and painful to the touch. Walking became excruciating. Standing was nearly impossible. The skin on her legs, according to private notes from her physician, often became discolored and warm, a polite euphemism for infection or poor circulation. This condition only worsened her overall scent. And yet, through it all, she continued to perform her duties, sitting through council meetings, receiving diplomats, and attending royal functions, while her courtiers tried not to breathe too deeply. Her public persona, however, remained that of a dignified, soft-spoken, and devout queen. The English people knew her as a woman of principle. They saw her weep openly after victories in war. They admired her loyalty to her husband, Prince George, and her devotion to the Church of England. But they did not see the daily struggles, the sweat-drenched corsets, the painful movements, the quiet negotiations around freshening her quarters before any foreign dignitary arrived. In the final years of her reign, Anne became increasingly isolated. Her friendships turned bitter, most famously with Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough. She spent much of her time in bed or seated in specially made chairs. Her health failed her slowly and publicly, but her appearance remained oddly consistent, face powdered, dress perfect, posture rigid. The illusion of dignity was preserved even as the reality of her condition became harder and harder to ignore. When she died in 1714, at the age of 49, her body had deteriorated to such an extent that it reportedly took hours to prepare it for public viewing. But by then, the public had already turned their attention to her successor, a German-speaking king with little love for English manners or politics, and even less for regular bathing. Because if you thought the Stuarts had poor hygiene, just wait until the Hanoverians arrived. Starting with George I, a king whose wigs were rarely cleaned, and whose scent was said to linger in the halls long after he had left them. When George I stepped off the boat from Hanover in 1714, England received its new king with all the enthusiasm of someone greeting a distant cousin they've only heard about through awkward letters, stiffly, warily, and with a polite smile that barely masked the cultural discomfort. And George, to his credit, met this lukewarm reception by immediately making himself even less appealing. Not with tyranny, not with scandal, but with odor. You see, George, I wasn't evil. He wasn't even particularly eccentric by royal standards. He was simply underwashed. And not in the rugged, muddy, sword-swinging way of his medieval predecessors, but in the slow, stale accumulation of someone who never quite grasped or cared about the concept of changing his clothes before they began changing themselves. From the beginning, the English court noticed something was off, or rather, something was on him. That something was a combination of sweat, wig powder, aged wool, and an old-world attitude toward hygiene that hadn't quite caught up with Enlightenment sensibilities. It wasn't that George had one single glaring flaw. It was that everything about him carried the faint, unmistakable must of a man who viewed washing as a theoretical concept. Let's start with his wigs. Like most men of his time, George wore powdered perukes, elaborate, curled constructions made of horsehair or human hair, soaked in powder to give them their distinctive colour and texture. Wigs in the 18th century were high maintenance. They needed brushing, fresh powder, and most importantly, cleaning. George opted out of the last part. According to multiple accounts, he wore his wigs for days at a time, often sweating beneath them during long meetings or royal ceremonies, without replacing or cleaning them properly. His attendants attempted to mask the odour with stronger powders, crushed lavender, clove, orris root, but these only temporarily delayed the inevitable. The wigs took on their own unique life force, stiff, dusty, and faintly sour. Beneath the wig, things didn't improve. George had a tendency to avoid personal washing beyond what was strictly necessary. He preferred dry cloth wipes and dabs of cologne over full immersion in water. Like many of his era, he believed bathing opened the body to illness. But while others at least made gestures toward freshness sponge baths, daily linen changes, George treated hygiene like a seasonal activity. Summer or winter, he wore his layers long and often. His clothes, which were richly embroidered and stiff with formality, were also reused frequently. Court tailors complained very quietly that the king often resisted changing outfits even when they were visibly worn or aromatic. It wasn't laziness, it was indifference. George saw clothing as utilitarian. If it still fit, it still worked. That applied to jackets, waistcoats, stockings, and, unfortunately, undergarments. There are subtle references in ambassadorial correspondence suggesting that George's presence had a way of settling in the room. One Viennese envoy remarked, with restrained diplomacy, that the king favours stillness, and the air around him abides accordingly. Which, if you've ever sat in a room where someone hasn't bathed since last Thursday, is exactly what it sounds like. His personal apartments were no better. While the public areas of his palaces were polished and gilded, George's private quarters developed a reputation for being, shall we say, less curated. Servants described the rooms as thick and humid, especially in the summer, with heavy curtains that blocked both sunlight and fresh air. He kept to himself, often sitting alone for long stretches of time, surrounded by papers, wigs, half-drunk cups of chocolate, and the faint smell of last week's coat. Interestingly, George's lack of hygiene never fully scandalized the British press, not because they didn't notice, but because they couldn't quite figure out how to mock it. His reign was already so distant, so culturally mismatched, that his odour became just another part of the foreign package. His accent, his disinterest in English politics, his preference for German cuisine, all of it formed a portrait of a monarch who ruled Britain without really being part of it. The smell was just one more barrier. He wasn't hated for it, but he certainly wasn't loved. In the end, George died in Germany, after a reign marked by quiet competence and almost no personal charisma. The people barely noticed his departure, perhaps because they'd barely noticed his presence. He left behind a throne, a dynasty, and several wigs that no servant dared to touch for weeks. But the crown didn't stay clean for long. His son, George II, inherited the throne and a complete disregard for cleanliness that made his father's habits look almost polite by comparison. Because if George I smelled musty, George II smelled like a man who believed sweat was proof of honesty and who saw nothing dishonest about wearing the same shirt for half a fortnight. George II. George II ruled for over 3 decades, but if longevity were any indication of cleanliness, he wouldn't be on this list. Sadly, George II didn't age like fine wine, he aged more like laundry left in the rain. Damp, sour, and increasingly hard to be around. In many ways, George II was a man obsessed with order. He rose early, stuck rigidly to routine, and demanded punctuality from everyone around him. His military discipline was legendary. He even fought in the Battle of Dettingen in 1743, the last British monarch to do so. But this external rigidity didn't extend to the inside of his collar, or behind his ears, or frankly, anywhere near soap. While he wasn't filthy in the overt, medieval sense, he wasn't dragging himself through ditches or sleeping in animal sheds. George II's hygiene issues were subtler and more insidious. He wasn't visibly covered in grime. He was perpetually unwashed. A monarch who did the bare minimum to appear clean while leaving behind a lingering air of body heat and week old linen. Multiple sources suggest that the king bathed irregularly, a few times a year, at most. He did not trust water. In fact, he feared it. He believed, like many of his generation, that immersing the body in warm water opened the pores and allowed in disease. Cold water, meanwhile, was unthinkable. The solution? Don't bathe. Instead, mask it. Perfumes and powders were a major part of his daily routine. He would coat his person in musky colognes, citrus oils, and floral extracts. At a distance, this created a plausible illusion of freshness. Up close, it revealed its real function: camouflage. Beneath the sweet notes of bergamot and rose, there was always something sourer, more lived in, the smell of garments worn too long and skin that hadn't seen proper scrubbing in weeks. And those garments, they didn't fare much better. George II was known for his love of simple military-style uniforms, practical, clean-cut, and functional. But while he may have liked the idea of clean lines, he didn't always follow through on clean clothes. His jackets, waistcoats, and breeches were often worn multiple times without washing. When his valet suggested rotating outfits more frequently, he dismissed it as unnecessary fuss. Laundry was done, yes, but sparingly. Fabric was expensive, dyes were delicate, and water, as we've established, was suspect. His underclothes were changed more regularly than his outerwear, but only just. Stockings, particularly, became a point of contention. One German courtier reported that the king's legs, though disciplined in posture, are often betrayed by scent. A sentence that tells you more than any medical report ever could. It wasn't just the body that went unwashed. His hair, or more precisely, his wigs told their own story. George II, like his father, wore powdered wigs daily. These wigs absorbed sweat and oil, especially during his famously vigorous court walks and long-standing meetings. But instead of cycling through them like a gentleman with a closet of options, George often reused the same few, relying on additional powder to reset the illusion. This didn't work. The scent of sweat mingling with old wig powder became a signature feature of his court appearances. His valet once wrote, in a letter not meant for public consumption, that the wig is freshened with hope more than hygiene. Diplomats began to note that audiences with the king required a short breath and a long memory. His grooming rituals were mostly surface level. He had his nails trimmed, his clothes brushed, and his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He cared deeply about presentation, just not about the parts no one could immediately see. If his cravat was crisp and his shoes gleamed, he assumed the rest would go unnoticed. It did not. George's wife, Queen Caroline, was more fastidious. She maintained a cleaner personal standard and reportedly found her husband's aversion to bathing frustrating, if not baffling. But she had little influence over his private habits. Theirs was a partnership of state more than intimacy, especially in later years. She occupied her own rooms, her own routines, and, presumably, her own airspace. And yet, George II never seemed to notice the discomfort he caused. He charged through life like a man convinced of his own rectitude in matters political, personal, and pungent. His temper was short, his manners brusque, and his tolerance for dissent non-existent. Courtiers didn't dare correct him, and when they did, he shouted, loudly, often in German. So the problem persisted. Day after day, week after week, a monarch in clean boots and unwashed skin. When he died in 1760, suddenly, after what was likely an aortic aneurysm, the physicians who examined him were reportedly startled by what they found beneath the royal garments. Not disease, necessarily, but the sheer persistence of royal neglect. His body had been perfectly groomed on the surface. Underneath, less so. But death, as ever, cleans what kings won't. And so the crown passed to George III, a king whose reign would be marked by brilliance, madness, empire, and extended periods where, during his mental episodes, he refused to bathe or change clothes at all. George III. George III, the king who lost America, ruled for 60 years and spent the better part of his later life arguing with invisible people, was, in his youth, regarded as a beacon of stability. Industrious, pious, and morally upright, he appeared to be everything his Hanoverian predecessors weren't. He didn't flaunt mistresses, he didn't gamble away fortunes, he didn't even drink to excess. In many ways, he seemed like the monarch England had been waiting for. But as it turns out, even a model king can be undone by the simple, persistent absence of a bath. George's early reign was remarkably clean in a metaphorical sense. His court was more restrained. His marriage to Queen Charlotte was faithful. His public image was carefully manicured to reflect a domestic, sober man of reason. And for a time, that image aligned fairly well with reality until reality began to erode. The erosion came slowly at first. Whispers of odd behavior, episodes of agitation, strange rambling conversations that began with policy and ended somewhere near theology. By the 1782nd, George's mental instability had become undeniable, and along with it came a collapse in his physical self-maintenance. His hygiene, once merely underwhelming, spiraled into outright neglect. During his periods of lucidity, George still maintained a basic personal routine. He dressed properly. He permitted himself to be groomed. He endured the occasional sponge bath reluctantly and under physicians' orders. But during his bouts of illness, which became more frequent and more intense as time wore on, he refused to change clothes for days, even weeks at a time. He would sweat through his garments and then sleep in them, eat in them, argue with them. One particularly grim diary entry from a court attendant described an occasion when George appeared at a private breakfast in a robe so stained and odoriferous that even the footmen avoided approaching. His Majesty waved cheerfully, the writer noted, and smelled as if he'd been riding through battle but only metaphorically. The king's rooms began to reflect his condition. While Queen Charlotte kept her own quarters in crisp order, George's became increasingly dishevelled. Curtains remained drawn, garments were strewn over furniture, plates half-eaten and never cleared. Servants, forbidden to interfere during his more volatile moods, often had to wait until the king fell asleep just to clean around the perimeter. They did so quietly, strategically, like battlefield medics. The state physicians did what they could, prescribing herbal tinctures, cool compresses, and calming baths. The problem? George wouldn't get in the tub. He resisted water with the fervour of a man convinced it contained some moral or political betrayal. He was reported to have once shouted, "I will not be drowned," when a bath was prepared despite being in his own palace on dry land, surrounded by puzzled attendants. He did occasionally allow himself to be wiped down, but only if convinced it was part of some ceremonial process. A cloth here, a dab of lavender water there, superficial at best. But even those moments of compromise became rare as his condition worsened. The court adapted. Curtains were swapped more frequently. Candles and herbs were burned at greater intensity. Royal tailors developed the habit of making identical outfits and sets, not for fashion's sake, but so the king could wear the same look continuously while the others were cleaned in rotation. When they were cleaned, the psychological impact was devastating. George, once so composed, became erratic and withdrawn, and his body followed suit. His nails grew long and uneven. His hair, often hidden beneath a wig, became increasingly unruly and unwashed. Even his famed blue eyes lost some of their clarity, ringed with shadows and sleeplessness. At times, he would speak to his reflection, unaware that he had not shaved, washed, or changed clothes in over a week. Yet, even in his decline, his court insisted on projecting the image of a king still in control. Paintings from this period portray him as serene and reflective, not a man who had recently spent several days pacing barefoot in the same wool trousers, muttering about clocks. The reality, as always, was carefully brushed under the nearest available rug. Eventually, his condition became unmanageable. He was removed from public life. His son, the future George IV, was appointed Prince Regent. George III lived out his final years at Windsor Castle, largely isolated, blind, and profoundly unwell. By then, his hygiene was a distant concern. The smell that once raised eyebrows at court now raised no comment at all. It was simply part of the atmosphere, like the draught or the tapestries. And so the once dutiful king, who had tried so hard to be better than his forebears, slipped into a fog of his own making. His body, once presented as a model of virtue, became another silent testament to the ways power can rot, even from within. His wife, Queen Charlotte, would carry on the role of consort with quiet resolve, but she, too, had her own olfactory legacy. Because, while her husband spoke to clocks, Charlotte's own mouth was becoming legendary for other reasons, most notably for the kind of breath that silenced entire salons. Queen Charlotte. Queen Charlotte, wife of George III, was known in her own time for her intellect, her patronage of the arts, her large family, and her unwavering poise. But behind the image of the soft-spoken, lace-wrapped consort of the Enlightenment era lay a woman whose personal hygiene, particularly her breath, quietly became a point of dread among those unfortunate enough to stand within conversational range. Charlotte wasn't a scandalous queen. In fact, she was famously proper. Devout, disciplined, and reserved to the point of being called dull by some contemporaries. She bore 15 children, rarely made political waves, and kept her thoughts to herself, a royal spouse in the most classical sense. But there was one thing she simply could not keep to herself: a mouthful of neglected dental ruin that became the quiet undoing of her courtly aura. Let's be clear, Queen Charlotte was not unique in having bad teeth. This was 18th century Europe, a time when sugar was fashionable, toothbrushes were optional, and dentistry was a battlefield of trial and error. But Charlotte's case stood out, not because it was rare, but because it was so aggressively unaddressed. By her 40s, the damage was done. Her teeth had darkened, some had begun to fall out, and the remaining few were described as discoloured and odorous by one especially unfortunate lady in waiting. Contemporary accounts from her inner circle refer to an air of sourness and the Queen's fading freshness, which, when decoded through layers of 18th century politeness, amounts to the Queen's breath could strip varnish off a harpsichord. The most charitable interpretations blamed it on illness. Charlotte suffered from a variety of health issues over her life: anxiety, migraines, bouts of melancholy, and these were seen as excuses for her physical decline. But her dental health was not an accident of fate. It was neglect, and worse, it was permitted. No one dared push the matter. Physicians of the day offered her clove oils and herbal rinses not as cures, but as weak apologies. Early tooth powders made of crushed eggshells and charcoal were available, but rarely used with discipline. Toothbrushes existed, but were seen as eccentric or even unnecessary, especially among older royals. Queen Charlotte may have held a brush once or twice a month. She likely rinsed with rose water. But she never developed a habit of genuine oral care, and over time, her mouth became the one part of her otherwise carefully controlled body that betrayed her. Her attendants knew, of course they knew. One courtier wrote, in a letter not meant for public circulation, that Her Majesty's speech is slow and deliberate, which may be wise the less air moved, the better. Another, more cryptically, praised her for not raising her voice in anger, which, given the context, reads like a strangely poetic form of self-defense. What made it worse was Charlotte's preference for conversation. She was curious, gentle, and intellectually inclined. She enjoyed long discussions with her children, her musicians, her botanists. But those conversations came at a cost. Her favourite botanist, Joseph Banks, later confessed that while he admired her mind, he kept a kerchief in his hand during every audience, for seasonal reasons, though it was understood those seasons had less to do with pollen and more to do with proximity. Even her famously large family could not avoid it. Her children, growing up in court, learned early to love their mother from a slight distance. She doted on them, she educated them, she cared for them. But hugs were brief, kisses even briefer, and bedtime stories likely ended with the windows flung open the moment she left the room. In portraits, of course, none of this appears. Queen Charlotte is immortalized in pearls, powdered hair, and silken gowns. Her face is calm, her posture elegant. But portraits don't capture scent. They don't depict the tension of a chambermaid holding her breath while pinning a brooch. They don't record the quiet relief when the Queen exits and the air begins to move again. Even George III, suffering in his own way from bouts of madness and poor hygiene, reportedly noticed, "There's a strange irony in a man who would sometimes wear the same outfit for days, noting someone else's unpleasant odour. But perhaps madness sharpens the senses in unexpected ways." In her later years, Charlotte withdrew more from public life, retreating into a quieter, more domestic role. She became the matriarch of a sprawling royal family, wrote letters, tended her gardens, and watched the world evolve from the confines of her increasingly musty drawing rooms. Her presence remained gentle, her scent not so much. When she died in 1818, the court mourned sincerely. She had been a devoted queen and a deeply loyal wife. But privately, her attendants set about airing out her chambers, scrubbing down the drapes, and, if rumour is to be believed, discreetly burning several of her personal linens. Yet if anyone expected her son, George IV, to learn from her hygienic missteps, they were sorely mistaken. He would not only inherit her crown but her legacy of bodily neglect and amplify it with gluttony, excess, and a scent that could clear a drawing room faster than a bad tax policy. George IV. George IV was the kind of man who could walk into a room dressed like an embroidered chandelier and still smell like he just crawled out of one. He was a king of contradiction, a monarch so obsessed with appearances that he once changed outfits 3 times in a single afternoon, yet who reeked so persistently of sweat, decay, and last night's indulgence that foreign dignitaries often described him in terms better suited to a cellar than a sovereign. Born in 1762, the future king was from the beginning enamored with grandeur. He adored fashion, theatre, and all things extravagant. He single-handedly revived the British taste for French tailors and Venetian silk, championed the architectural fever dream of the Brighton Pavilion, and spent an obscene portion of the royal budget on gilded furniture, custom snuff boxes, and dinnerware that could feed a village but barely served a single man. His outward life was a performance, and the stage was always set for spectacle. But peel back the velvet curtain, and you'd find a man whose physical upkeep couldn't keep pace with his wardrobe. George IV's hygiene was, by every polite account, catastrophic. Though he lavished money on perfumes, colognes, and scented oils, he did so to mask the problem, not solve it. Beneath the musk of imported bergamot and orange blossom was a body that rarely saw fresh water. He bathed infrequently, and even then only when compelled by medical advice, romantic opportunity, or political obligation, and sometimes not even then. Unlike his predecessors, who often avoided bathing due to old-world superstitions about pores and bad air, George had no such excuses. He simply didn't like the effort. Baths took time, towels had to be warmed, water had to be carried, and most importantly, he had to move. And by the time George entered his 42nd, movement was not his strong suit. Obese, heavily perfumed, and perpetually perspiring, George IV was less a king than a glistening monument to unchecked appetites. He could eat enough for 3 men and drink enough for 4, often doing both in one sitting. And after such sessions, which sometimes lasted from midday to midnight, he would retreat not to a bath, but to bed. Still dressed, still damp, still emitting the rich, pungent consequences of roast duck and fortified wine. One of his valets recorded, with barely concealed horror, that the king often refused to change his shirt for several days, preferring instead to layer more perfume and powder over the existing situation. That situation included undergarments that were routinely discarded rather than washed, not because they were treated as disposable, but because they were considered beyond salvation. His garments, lavish though they were, often betrayed him. Court observers described the cuffs of his coats as discoloured, the linings of his jackets as clinging, and his stockings as visibly strained. His boots, though polished to perfection on the outside, were known to carry an odour that lingered well after he'd left the room. It didn't help that George had terrible teeth, or what remained of them. Years of neglect, sugar, and strong drink left his mouth in ruins. His breath became a subject of court gossip, with one particularly dry observer noting that it could melt diplomacy. He attempted to mitigate this with peppermints, cloves, and soaked handkerchiefs, but these efforts were only marginally more effective than waving scented flags at a fire. Mistresses, of which he had many, tolerated him with varying degrees of endurance. Some were silent, some were strategic, but a few were bold enough to leave behind damning observations. One wrote in a private letter that George was a man of grand appetites and little soap, and another remarked that while his conversation was seductive, it was best enjoyed from at least 3 feet away. But even beyond the intimacy of his personal relationships, the king's hygiene impacted public life. His subjects, already disillusioned by his extravagance, began to whisper about the disconnect between the polished exterior and the rank reality. Caricaturists had a field day, often depicting him as a bloated dandy surrounded by clouds of stink lines, labelled with words like eau d'excess and royal decay. Physicians attempted interventions. They prescribed walks, tonics, warm baths, and moderate diets. George ignored all of it. His idea of self-care was another waistcoat and a stronger scent. He seemed to believe that if he looked the part of a king, if his robes sparkled and his shoes shone, then nothing underneath could contradict him. But they did. Every time he moved, every time he Saturday, every time he breathed. When George IV died in 1830, the public reaction was mixed. Some mourned the loss of a monarch who had at least given the nation a good show. Others sighed in relief, not just politically, but possibly aromatically. The court aired out the halls, replaced his bedding, and burned several articles of clothing with ceremonial finality. His brother, William IV, would ascend the throne next. He lacked George's taste, George's flair, and George's ability to drive perfume merchants to profit. But he brought his own special flavour of royal negligence, one that would leave stains, both literal and historical, on everything he touched. William IV. William IV, known affectionately and sometimes sarcastically as the Sailor King, was perhaps the least refined of the British monarchs in the modern era. He was bluff, loud, impatient, and startlingly indifferent to the decorative rituals of kingship. To some, this was refreshing. After the over-lacquered spectacle of George IV, William's plainness felt like a splash of cold, if slightly murky, water. But that plainness came at a price, and the price was his hygiene. William didn't just neglect self-maintenance, he made a personality out of it. Having spent much of his early life in the Royal Navy, William developed an enduring fondness for sailor-like habits which, in his case, included swearing, overeating, impulsive decision-making, and a reluctance to wash anything that didn't absolutely require it. He brought these traits with him to the throne in 1830, and while the royal household adjusted quickly to his salty language and erratic temper, nothing quite prepared them for the smell. Unlike his extravagant older brother George IV, William didn't invest in perfumes, powders, or scented gloves. In fact, he seemed vaguely annoyed by the entire concept of fragrance. He considered cologne foppish, wigs unnecessary, and fancy soaps a French invention. His approach to grooming was utilitarian at best, negligent at worst. A quick splash of cold water on the face, a roughly combed head of thinning hair, and a coat that had clearly seen the inside of more than one breakfast room that was the king's version of getting ready. His clothes were a special matter of court despair. William routinely wore garments long past their acceptable limit. Trousers stained from meals, waistcoats rebuttoned to hide tears, and cuffs that bore the unmistakable wear of long hours dragging across wooden tables. According to his valet, the king had a fondness for a particular blue frock coat, which he insisted on wearing until the seams gave out despite repeated offers from tailors to produce identical replacements. He believed in loyalty. Unfortunately, that loyalty extended to clothing that should have been retired during the Napoleonic Wars. Food didn't help. William was a hearty eater, though not in the fine dining sense. His meals were messy, and his shirts bore witness. He often ate with his hands, especially when enjoying roasted meats or buttered vegetables, and he wasn't shy about licking his fingers or wiping them on the closest available surface, including, at times, his own trousers. Napkins were offered, often ignored. One dinner guest, writing privately to a friend, remarked that sitting next to the king during a meal was like being on a ship where the cook is also the captain. Charming, perhaps, in a rustic way, until you smelled the grease baked into his cuffs. William also had a strange resistance to laundry. He reportedly considered the frequent changing of undergarments a sign of weakness. Shirts were worn and reworn, sometimes flipped inside out to extend their lifespan. Stockings followed a similar rule, changed only when holes became structurally compromising. His boots, though polished, carried the scent of a man who had once walked miles and never told them they could stop. His hair was rarely washed and often tousled from sleep. When advised to cut it shorter, he refused, stating that he preferred to run a hand through it rather than have it fussed over. Court painters frequently requested that he sit for portraits after a grooming session, but those sessions rarely happened. One artist resorted to sketching from memory, noting in a side margin that His Majesty's hair presented more like wind-blown straw than the regal curls I had prepared for. William's wife, Queen Adelaide, was the picture of decorum, modest, clean, reserved. Their personalities couldn't have been more different. She tolerated his slovenliness with the stoic patience of someone deeply committed to a higher cause, preserving what little court dignity remained. Behind closed doors, it was said she arranged extra cleanings of his chambers, discreetly rotated his wardrobe, and even burned a few particularly offensive pieces of linen while he was distracted in council. Servants adjusted. They learned to handle him like a barn cat with respect, from a distance, and ideally, with protective gloves. They aired out his rooms daily, applied lavender sachets to his chairs, and took extra pains to keep staterooms ventilated before major events. Guests invited to dine with the king were warned, half-jokingly, to arrive hungry and breathe shallow. Yet for all of this, William remained oddly beloved. His subjects, weary of royal pomp and scandal, found his bluntness oddly refreshing. They saw in him a return to something more real, more human, even if that humanity occasionally smelled like yesterday's stew and pipe smoke. When he died in 1837, the throne passed to his young niece, Victoria, a queen who would bring cleanliness, order, and obsessive self-control back to the monarchy. But if you think the Victorian era ushered in a golden age of royal hygiene, you haven't seen what happens when a woman refuses to change her underclothes for weeks because she believes it's unladylike to be naked even in the bath. Queen Victoria was fastidious about rules, but washing, that was still optional. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria is often imagined in sepia tones, stern eyes, black dress, a face that never cracked a smile unless it absolutely had to. She was the immovable object at the heart of an empire that spanned continents, a woman whose moral rigidity came to define an entire era. But beneath the endless portraits and empire building, there was also the small, neglected matter of her personal hygiene, or, more precisely, her pointed lack of it. To be fair, Victoria wasn't grotesquely dirty. She wasn't wallowing in grime or wearing the same dress for months like some of her predecessors. But she subscribed to a belief, deeply Victorian, deeply stubborn, that regular full-body bathing was not only unnecessary, but somehow indecent. Nudity, even in private, even alone, even in the bath, was unseemly. And so, in a royal twist of logic, the Queen of England, the literal head of an empire, avoided bathing because it made her feel too exposed. She preferred sponge baths, superficial dabs with a damp cloth, often assisted by her ladies-in-waiting. The goal wasn't so much to clean as it was to refresh in the way a wilting bouquet might be spritzed with water and left to look alive. These cleansing routines were conducted with strict modesty. She refused to be seen undressed, even by her attendants. The bath was curtained. The washing was minimal. The result? A queen who looked perfectly put together in photographs, but was, by most olfactory accounts, at best musty. Her underclothes, famously, were rarely changed. Victoria believed that proper women did not fuss about with such things, and she wore her petticoats and corsets well past the point of freshness. There are accounts of her underlayers being aired out rather than washed, perfumed rather than scrubbed, and gently fluffed between wears like heirloom drapes. The Queen's inner garments became a sort of textile archive, retaining the warmth, memory, and, unfortunately, the scent of her royal body. One particularly weary maid confessed in a letter that folding Victoria's unwashed underclothes was like turning the pages of a private diary one you'd rather not read. Her bedchamber followed suit. Though her palaces were kept immaculate in terms of decoration, her personal space was less rigorously maintained. The room was often stuffy, the drapes drawn tight, the linens perfumed but not freshly laundered as often as the housekeeping staff preferred. She found the rituals of deep cleaning invasive. Her preferences were respected, sometimes out of duty, sometimes out of fear. And then, of course, there was the matter of mourning. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, Victoria plunged into a grief so consuming that it rewired her entire lifestyle. She wore black every day for the rest of her life. She refused to sleep in the royal bed. She limited her public appearances, and critically, her already minimal self-care dropped even further. In mourning, she adopted an almost monastic resistance to comfort, which included comfort derived from warm water, clean sheets, or fresh clothes. It was part of the penance. She was visibly clean. She was presentably clean, but never truly, deeply clean. Her physicians advised her to bathe more regularly. They recommended saltwater soaks, aromatic rinses, and regular linen changes. She dismissed most of these suggestions as frivolous, even immodest. The body, she believed, was best left alone, better to be slightly odorous than indecent. What's more, she simply didn't believe it mattered. She was the Queen. She was the symbol of moral authority. What were a few days of sweat when your shadow stretched across the globe? And so, she endured wrapped in history, draped in black, perfumed just enough to keep the upholstery safe. When she died in 1901, the attendants who prepared her body reportedly encountered a woman not grotesque, not diseased, but unmistakably lived in. Her garments told a long story. Her linens held quiet truths. But the monarchy rolled on, and with it, her husband's legacy, though Albert, long dead by then, had left behind more than a grieving widow. He had also left behind a reputation for being perhaps the cleanest man in the Victorian royal household, which, given the competition, is not saying much. But even Prince Albert, buttoned up, proper, Germanically disciplined, had his own problem. A body odour so persistent that it clung to his clothes, no matter how many buttons he polished. Prince Albert, consort to Queen Victoria, looked like the kind of man who smelled good. His portraits suggest order, cleanliness, and starch. He was the model of Victorian propriety, hair parted with geometric precision, moustache groomed to an architectural degree, waistcoat perfectly aligned with his moral compass. He was the kind of person who colour-coded his thoughts, and yet, by several court accounts, standing too close to him was something of a gamble. The problem wasn't rot or filth or outright slovenliness. Albert was fastidious, painfully so. He kept to a rigorous daily schedule, exercised regularly, and oversaw the education of his children with the severity of a Prussian schoolmaster. His grooming habits were exact. He brushed his teeth, shaved daily, and changed his linen shirts with more frequency than any of his royal in-laws, but he carried with him always a peculiar and unshakable smell. We would call it chronic body odor. The Victorians did not have such language. They simply said that he had a scent about him, or that his presence preceded him. Some more poetic observers noted that he left a room less silently than he entered it, which, while subtle, doesn't leave much room for ambiguity. Albert's body odor was not the result of neglect. It was the result of biology. His sweat, even after bathing, returned quickly, and once it mingled with his starched shirts and woolen coats, it lingered. His attendants tried everything. They adjusted his diet. They suggested vinegar washes, eucalyptus oils, and even imported French colognes, which, to Albert, were not just unnecessary, but slightly immoral. He believed in natural living. The idea of masking one's real scent struck him as weak, even deceptive. This conviction did not extend to those around him. Queen Victoria, for one, noticed. Her diaries, while affectionate, hint to the issue. She once wrote that, "My dear Albert is so industrious and warm," with the word warm underlined. Another entry notes, without judgment but with clarity, that his shirts required more frequent laundering than hers, though worn but briefly. Servants confirmed what the Queen politely omitted. Albert's chambers needed additional ventilation. His garments were sent out for washing more often than protocol required. The fabric beneath his arms wore out faster than any other part of his wardrobe. And when he removed his gloves, as he often did while lecturing a child or examining a report, it was generally agreed that the air moved in response. Despite all this, Albert was revered. He was intelligent, hard-working, and deeply committed to public service. His contributions to the Great Exhibition of 1851, to educational reform, and to the moral direction of the monarchy were monumental. But his scent lingered in the margins of those achievements, a detail never officially recorded, yet frequently remembered. Even in death, his presence clung. The clothes he wore in his final days were preserved by Victoria, sealed in glass, never washed, never aired. She visited them regularly for decades, perhaps unaware that they carried not just the memory of the man, but the faint, ghostly scent of his unrelenting body chemistry. And so ends the brief moment of supposed royal cleanliness. Because after Albert, the throne passed to their son, a man whose charm could fill a ballroom, but whose breath could empty one. Edward VII had inherited the crown, the mistresses, the cigars, and quite unfortunately for everyone involved, a mouth that smelled like the last century. Edward VII was a man who dressed like a cologne advertisement, but smelled like it had been printed on a damp napkin. The eldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Bertie, as he was known before his coronation, spent most of his life waiting for a job. He finally became king in 1901 at the ripe age of 59, a milestone that came with grandeur, glory, and, unfortunately, a breath that courtiers whispered about more than his foreign policy. Let's not pretend he wasn't charming. Edward VII was, by all accounts, a master of social performance. He knew how to put people at ease, how to flatter without fawning, how to command a room without raising his voice. He was generous, funny, a little scandalous, and thoroughly irresistible to the upper crust of European society. But none of this quite distracted from the quietly devastating fact that speaking with him at close range was a challenge. The problem was his teeth, or what remained of them. Edward's dental hygiene, even by 19th century standards, was lacking. This is a man who loved his cigars, adored his rich French cuisine, and enjoyed the kind of sugar-laced desserts that made dentists retire early. He was not fond of brushing. He was not interested in flossing, and he absolutely did not believe in sacrificing even a moment of indulgence for something as pedestrian as a dental checkup. The result? His breath could weaponize a garden party. One French ambassador famously described the king's breath as profound, a term that in most contexts suggests philosophical depth, but in this one meant olfactory despair. Another diplomat, slightly less generous, referred to His Majesty's atmospheric presence, which sounds charming until you realize it was a euphemism for breath so potent that it lingered in the upholstery. Edward's love life made matters even more complicated. He was a serial womanizer, enjoying a lengthy parade of mistresses with names that read like a social register crossed with a scandal sheet. They tolerated him, mostly. Some reportedly kept scented handkerchiefs on them at all times. Others adopted a strategy of meeting him in well-ventilated conservatories or arranging their chairs at a dignified conversational distance. His valet, a man of truly saintly patience, noted in his private journals that the king refused most rinses, preferring instead to chew cloves or dab cologne beneath his nose. Occasionally he would be coaxed into a tooth-scraping, but these were rare and performed with what the valet called royal reluctance. The issue, of course, wasn't isolated to the mouth. Edward was a man of appetites, and appetites have consequences. He was fond of 12-course meals, eaten late, accompanied by wine, port, cigars, and brandy. He sweated often, belched freely, and had a habit of wiping his mouth on the back of his hand before extending it to others. He wore perfume, certainly, but mostly out of necessity. Even his coronation was nearly derailed by his body. Just days before the ceremony, he developed a severe case of appendicitis. Emergency surgery was performed, a rare and risky endeavour at the time, and the nation held its breath. The king, meanwhile, likely continued to hold his cigar. He survived, but the whole affair served as a reminder that beneath the medals, sashes, and top hats was still a man of flesh, weakness, and poor hygiene. Edward VII reigned for just 9 years, from 1901 to 1910. And in that time he defined the tone of the Edwardian era: sophisticated, decadent, and slightly overripe. His charisma was undeniable, but it came with an aroma that even loyalty couldn't ignore. And when he died, his mistresses attended his funeral in mourning veils, perhaps weeping, perhaps breathing easier for the first time in years. His wife, Queen Alexandra of Denmark, had endured it all with remarkable grace. But she too had her secrets, not least among them her own aversion to bathing, rooted in fears of worsening her chronic rheumatism. Together, they were the royal couple who looked like they had walked out of a painting and smelled like they had never left the canvas. Alexandra of Denmark. Queen Alexandra of Denmark, consort to Edward VII, was beauty wrapped in restraint, delicacy wrapped in dignity, and quietly, a queen who managed to cultivate elegance while avoiding baths as if they were acts of betrayal. Alexandra's public image was immaculate. Known for her ethereal charm, impeccable fashion sense, and graceful demeanour, she embodied the ideal of the Edwardian queen, poised, aloof, eternally composed. She was the type of royal who never raised her voice, never made a scene, and never, ever allowed her physical frailty to interfere with her duty. But privately, she battled a number of chronic health issues, chief among them a long-standing case of rheumatism that she believed made bathing dangerous. In fairness, bathing during the 19th century was no spa day. It was a complicated operation involving gallons of water, heavy tubs, a team of servants, and, often, a drafty room with inconsistent heat. But Alexandra took her caution to extremes. She avoided full-body immersion almost entirely in her later years. She relied instead on sponge baths, gentle, partial, and performed with privacy. Washing her hair was a rare ordeal, postponed as long as possible. One of her ladies-in-waiting noted delicately that the Queen's curls often retained the perfume of yesterday's toilette, which is about as close as court language ever comes to saying, "This could use a rinse." Her clothing, though spectacularly well made, was rarely laundered in full. Like other royals of the era, Alexandra believed that washing fine garments too frequently would ruin their structure and dye. Instead, she opted for brushing, perfuming, and rotating a cycle that preserved the garment's appearance, but not always their freshness. It was said that entering her dressing room was like walking into a field of roses at dusk. Beautiful, certainly, but heavy, fading, and oddly still. Alexandra also suffered from a partial hearing loss, which further contributed to her isolation. She rarely engaged in small talk and often smiled vaguely during conversations, regardless of what was being said. This gave her a mystique part saint, part statue, but it also meant she often missed subtle cues from others, including hints that perhaps more than lavender was needed that day. Still, she was beloved. Her subjects adored her grace. Her children admired her discipline. Her husband, though notoriously unfaithful, respected her composure and perhaps appreciated that she never commented on his own equally suspect hygiene. Together, they were like an Edwardian perfume bottle, beautifully crafted, intricately designed, and sealed tight. When Alexandra died in 1925, she left behind not just her jewels and letters, but a lingering example of how royalty had perfected the art of appearing flawless while quietly ignoring the mechanics of basic hygiene. Her legacy was not dirt, but denial, the grand tradition of smelling like powdered roses instead of freshly bathed skin. But her son, George V, would inherit the throne with all the weight of empire and a dental situation that made his courtiers develop the reflex of bowing and stepping back. Because the next sovereign didn't smell bad in general just from the mouth outward. George V. George V was the very picture of restraint. He wasn't flashy like his father Edward VII, nor did he possess the theatrical self-invention of his grandmother Victoria. He was, in many ways, a throwback. A conservative man who wore the same clothes for decades, preferred plain food, and once said that he only wanted to be remembered as a good man who did his duty. But behind that dutiful mustache was a problem no amount of khaki or court etiquette could hide. George V had famously, chronically, and disturbingly bad breath. To be clear, George V was not filthy. He wasn't a human grease trap like some of his predecessors, and he didn't walk around in food-stained trousers mumbling about tradition. But his oral hygiene or lack thereof was quietly notorious throughout his reign. The issue was so persistent and so widely acknowledged among those who had to deal with him up close that it became a kind of private horror for his staff and foreign dignitaries alike. His breath wasn't mildly unpleasant. It was unforgettable. The cause? Decades of dental neglect. George V came from a generation that regarded dentistry as optional at best and emasculating at worst. Toothbrushing was not a firmly established daily routine for most Victorians, and the habit didn't really catch on with George, even as he ascended to the throne. Combine this with his love of cigars, which he smoked constantly, sometimes more than a dozen a day, and you get a king whose mouth had the bouquet of a burnt library left out in the rain. One of his private secretaries reportedly referred to His Majesty's breath as punishing. Another wrote that audiences with the king are brief, not out of protocol, but out of necessity. American President Woodrow Wilson, after a state meeting with George during the post-World War I peace conferences was said to have declined a second audience. The official reason was scheduling. The unofficial reason was that his aides had quietly warned him not to go in without a strong stomach. The odd thing was that George V himself was clean in every other regard. He took great pride in military grooming. His uniforms were always pressed, his boots polished, and his posture flawless. He loved naval order and ran the royal household like a battleship. But oral hygiene never made it into the schedule. His daily routine included shaving, dressing, and inspecting everything from correspondence to kennel dogs, but not by all accounts rinsing or brushing. When asked about his habits, George would often scoff. He viewed newfangled hygiene products with suspicion and disliked foreign soaps and imported pastes. His preferred method of freshening up after a long day was to wash his face and change his collar. The rest, apparently, would sort itself out. His valets began to keep peppermint drops on hand, offering them with the same strategic care one might use to defuse a bomb. At court, rules were quietly developed. Audiences with the king rarely lasted more than 10 minutes, and it was understood without anyone needing to say it that direct eye contact was preferred not because of royal formality, but because turning one's head would invite the full brunt of the royal breath. Servants began lighting candles in his drawing rooms before meetings, even in daylight. And yet, George's subjects loved him. He represented stability. He stood firm during the First World War, rebranded the family from the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the House of Windsor with immaculate political timing, and refused to abandon London during the Blitz. He was every inch the wartime king. The smell, apparently, came with the job. When he died in 1936, it was discovered that several of his remaining teeth were in such poor condition that they had likely caused chronic infections. But the mystery was over. The scent that had haunted royal halls was silenced at last. His wife, Queen Mary, was left behind a woman with more poise than warmth, more pearls than smiles, and a royal presence so commanding it often distracted from the fact that she, too, preferred perfume to actual bathing. Queen Mary, consort of George V, mother to 2 kings, and one of the most regal presences to ever glide across a marble floor, was a living museum piece. Impeccably dressed, unflinchingly formal, and armed with a glare that could stop a footman mid-bow, she was the monarchy's living embodiment of imperial dignity. But beneath all that velvet and discipline was a woman with a long-standing aversion to full-body bathing. To be fair, Queen Mary looked like someone who smelled of rosewater and polished silver. Her gowns were pristine, her jewelry was legendary, her posture was carved from pure obligation. But the truth, whispered by valets and confirmed by courtiers, was that her cleanliness, like her warmth, was more symbolic than literal. Mary preferred sponge baths. She saw them as sufficient, modest, and far more appropriate than the extravagance of soaking in a tub like a common actress. In fact, she reportedly believed that full immersion was unbecoming for a woman of her station, too indulgent, too modern, too continental. She washed the parts of herself that would be seen. The rest she trusted to fabric, perfume, and God. Her rooms smelled of violets and talcum powder, but only when the windows were open. Otherwise, the air inside her private chambers had what one servant politely described as a retired quality, meaning that it smelled like something that had stopped trying. Her sheets were crisp, her shoes polished, but her body, particularly in the later years of her life, began to carry the unmistakable undertone of someone who believed cleanliness was more about perception than perspiration. Her clothing habits didn't help. Queen Mary was notorious for re-wearing garments for decades, not days, not seasons, decades. She considered wastefulness the ultimate sin and frugality a royal virtue. Some of her dresses were so old they had outlived multiple footmen. Though they were kept in good condition, they were not regularly washed. Instead, they were brushed down, pressed, and occasionally aired in front of open fires. Mary's perfume habits were equally idiosyncratic. She didn't believe in changing scents to match moods. She wore the same floral heavy eau de toilette for years, sometimes decades. It became her signature, not so much a fragrance as a fog. Staff members learned to identify her presence in a room by scent alone. And while it was not unpleasant, it often carried the overripe heaviness of potpourri left too long in a sealed jar. Servants were careful. You didn't correct Queen Mary. You didn't suggest that perhaps a bath might lift her spirits. You certainly didn't mention anything about smell. Instead, you added a little more lavender to her powder. You aired out the room more aggressively when she was in the garden. You changed the cushions more often than protocol required. To the public, she remained majestic. She never slipped. She never faltered. And yet, those closest to her knew that her body, like her personality, was wrapped in a protective cocoon, carefully maintained, never quite opened, and never quite fresh. When she died in 1953, her legacy was one of stoic dignity. But some of her belongings, particularly her gloves and gowns, were not preserved. Not because they lacked historical value, but because they had absorbed too much of their wearer. They carried not just the shape of her hands, but the life she lived in them. Her son, Edward VIII, would take the throne next and hold it briefly. But even in that short window, he managed to uphold a royal tradition that no abdication could erase: the strange refusal to wash regularly, even while looking like a man pulled straight from a fashion catalogue. Edward VIII. Edward VIII looked like the future. Clean lines, polished shoes, razor-sharp suits from Savile Row, a walking catalogue of modern masculinity, wrapped in charm and finished with a Windsor knot. He was photogenic, fashion-forward, and moved like someone who had never known true inconvenience. But beneath the sleek exterior of the Prince of Wales turned King of England, if only briefly, was a royal who didn't just neglect personal hygiene. He rejected it. By all accounts, Edward was obsessed with image. He was the first British royal to truly understand the power of photography, and he used it with almost military precision. He knew his angles, his lighting, and how to make a suit fall just right across his shoulders, but image is not scent. And when the flashbulbs were off, Edward had a habit of smelling like yesterday's man in today's tailoring. He did not bathe regularly. His staff, many of whom had served his father and grandfather, were stunned to discover how rarely he touched water. Mornings began not with a bath, but with a quick splash of cold water and a generous misting of cologne. Edward didn't see the point in full immersion. He preferred to freshen up, which usually meant changing into a new suit and hoping no one noticed what remained underneath. It wasn't laziness. It was entitlement. Edward believed that being a king, or a near king, as it turned out, meant never having to deal with the mundane. Personal hygiene, to him, was one of those invisible labours best left to someone else. He outsourced his dignity to silk shirts and press photos, and it worked as long as no one got too close. Multiple staff members confirmed the issue. His undergarments were often damp with sweat after public engagements, but instead of being sent for laundering, they were left hanging on the back of chairs or tossed casually onto a chaise lounge. The smell that developed was not aggressive, not the barnyard musk of earlier monarchs, but stale, faintly sour, the scent of someone who had mastered the art of dressing over a problem. Edward also had a fondness for smoking both cigarettes and cigars, and he smoked constantly. This, combined with his reluctance to brush his teeth more than occasionally, led to chronic bad breath. Lady-in-Waiting memoirs described meetings in which Edward leaned close to speak and left behind a conversational fog that made even hardened courtiers blink. One diplomat referred to him with remarkable subtlety as a man of elegance who nevertheless leaves a strong impression. His relationships didn't help. Edward's romantic entanglements were legendary, but behind the scandal of his abdication to marry Wallis Simpson lay a quieter, olfactory truth. He wasn't easy to live with. Wallis herself is rumoured to have made remarks in private about Edward's hygiene. She reportedly insisted on separate dressing rooms and encouraged him to change clothes more often than he would have on his own. Whether it worked is unclear, but the fact that effort was needed speaks volumes. Edward's clothes, though meticulously tailored, were not cleaned as often as they should have been. His suits were brushed, not washed. His shoes were polished, but rarely aired. His socks, rotated less frequently than advisable, carried the low, enduring scent of long walks and short standards. His brief reign spared many the proximity. But for those who worked behind the scenes, valets, dressers, drivers, the experience was uniquely frustrating. They served a man who looked like a model and smelled like someone impersonating one. When Edward abdicated in 1936, the British public mourned the fairy tale image. What they didn't know, what they never smelled, was that the fantasy had always been built on fabric and distance. He spent the rest of his life in exile, giving interviews, attending parties, and continuing his lifelong commitment to dressing impeccably and bathing selectively. And Wallis? She maintained the appearance of glamour, but there were always murmurs, whispers that behind the couture and jewels was a woman battling more than just royal scorn. She had a secret too, or rather, a scent. One that betrayed the same charming neglect Edward had brought with him, this time with lipstick and pearls. Wallis Simpson. Wallis Simpson was known for her wit, her fashion, and her uncanny ability to cause international crises over cocktails. She was sharp-tongued, sharply dressed, and often treated as the villain of the abdication drama. But she didn't just make waves, she made impressions, lasting ones, especially nasal. To the world, Wallis was the image of elegance. Her clothes were perfect, her voice crisp, and her figure maintained with near-military discipline. But behind the silk scarves and Cartier brooches was a woman who, according to several of her closest acquaintances, had a persistent problem with oral hygiene that made intimate conversations something of a gamble. Her teeth, it seems, were the root of the issue. Wallis came from modest beginnings, and her early access to proper dental care was limited. As she rose in society, she acquired the gowns, the etiquette, and the jewels, but the damage was already done. Her breath, according to friends, was difficult to ignore, not every day, not every moment, but often enough to be noticed and mentioned, quietly, frequently. Servants referred to her scent obliquely. "Madam prefers mints," one maid wrote in a journal. Another described her as fragrant until spoken to. It was said that she applied perfume directly to her neck before every social function, but never visited a dentist more than once every few years. She brushed, she powdered, she sprayed, but the breath remained. Like Edward, she relied heavily on appearance. She understood better than most the power of optics that looking clean could sometimes distract from being clean. Her wardrobe was legendary. Her parties were immaculate, but the closer one got, the more the illusion cracked. Several letters from guests at her French villa mentioned the experience of dining with the Duchess of Windsor as charming but airless. It didn't help that she shared Edward's aversion to daily bathing, not because of laziness, but because of vanity. Wallis believed frequent bathing dried out the skin and aged a woman prematurely. She once reportedly told a friend that a lady should always smell of perfume, never soap. The perfume, however, had a hard job. Her dressing room was a battleground of scents: lavender, rose, amber, and something vaguely chemical all layered over a body that hadn't been scrubbed properly in days. Her gowns were spritzed, not washed. Her shoes rarely rotated. Her gloves worn until their stitching began to absorb what the skin beneath had not released. Still, Wallace maintained control over her image. She posed, she smiled, she danced. People remembered the diamonds and the sharp wit, but they also remembered that she rarely leaned in close. And when she did, they leaned back. She and Edward lived out their lives in exile, bound together by scandal, vanity, and just enough distance from England and each other to make the whole thing bearable. They were beautiful, brittle, and faintly sour. A couple that looked like a perfume ad and smelled like it had gone off. After Wallace came George VI, Edward's quieter, steadier brother, a man who carried the weight of monarchy on trembling shoulders, and who bore his own strange dental legacy. His breath didn't charm. It didn't seduce. It just filled the room. Because cleanliness may have returned to the throne, but mouthwash still hadn't. George VI. George VI was not meant to be king. He was the shy, stammering second son, the one who walked 2 steps behind, who hated public speaking, who preferred quiet rooms to royal processions. But when his brother, Edward VIII, abdicated the throne for love and, as we've established, poor hygiene, George was thrust into history with all the ceremony of a man being handed a live grenade. He rose to the occasion with dignity, grit, and a quiet sense of duty. He became a wartime icon, a symbol of stability. But none of that changed the fact that his breath could empty a room faster than an air raid siren. George VI was a deeply nervous man. Painfully self-conscious, introverted, and emotionally wound like a violin string, he struggled under the weight of kingship from day one. And as anyone who has ever chewed a fingernail during a stressful week knows, chronic anxiety and dental health are not friends. George ground his teeth. He clenched his jaw. He suffered from ulcers, stomach troubles, and frequent indigestion, all of which added layers of scent to a breath that was already under siege from a lifetime of dental neglect. By the time he became king in 1936, George's teeth were in open revolt. Decades of inconsistent care, combined with the royal family's generational indifference to brushing, had left his mouth in a state one courtier tactfully described as unfortunate. A more blunt foreign diplomat simply called him a kind man, poorly perfumed at the mouth. This wasn't just a case of bad breath. It was chronic, the kind that made conversation a tactical event. Attendees of private meetings learned to sit at oblique angles. Ministers developed the habit of pausing mid-sentence, not out of deference, but to strategically inhale away from the royal line of fire. His speeches, heard over the radio, were moving and noble. In person, they were something else entirely. There were attempts to manage it. Doctors recommended dietary changes. Staff urged him toward more frequent cleanings. He complied sometimes, but his natural modesty, combined with his embarrassment over his stammer and public image, made any discussion of his dental situation excruciating. He wasn't a man who took critique lightly, and certainly not when it concerned his own body. There's evidence that George suffered from multiple untreated infections in his gums. He also had several missing or damaged teeth that were either not replaced or poorly fitted with early dentures. And, like his father and brother before him, he smoked constantly. Chain smoking was his nervous tick, and during the height of World War II, he was rarely seen without a cigarette in hand. All of this conspired to turn his breath into a kind of royal security hazard. Yet his personal cleanliness was otherwise respectable. Unlike his predecessors, George VI believed in bathing. He dressed neatly, if conservatively. He wore cologne sparingly, and always the same brand. He kept his fingernails clean, his shoes polished, his uniforms pressed. But none of this helped with the breath, which persisted like a ghost at every gathering. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, handled it with her usual stoicism. She adored him not for his smell, obviously, but for his heart. Her own sharp sense of humor allowed her to joke about it privately, but never cruelly. She simply accepted that part of being married to the king was mastering the art of exhaling slowly while nodding in support. George VI's reign was defined by duty. He didn't enjoy the spotlight, but he stood in it anyway. Through bombings, broadcasts, and post-war rebuilding, he remained a figure of unshowy courage. His people respected him. His advisors admired him. His dentist, one assumes, had regular nightmares. He died in 1952, leaving behind a daughter who would define the monarchy for the next 70 years and, more immediately, a chamber in Windsor Castle that reportedly required deep airing out. But before Queen Elizabeth II stepped fully into power, there was one more figure of scandal and smoke still lingering in the royal narrative. George VI's younger daughter, Princess Margaret, had inherited the family's charm, style, and sense of spectacle, along with a breath that could ruin a martini. Princess Margaret was the royal family's most glamorous liability. She was beautiful, witty, impeccably dressed, and almost allergic to moderation. In a family of stiff upper lips and tepid handshakes, she was a hurricane in diamonds and cigarette smoke. But behind the laughter and luxury, the parties, the lovers, the photo ops, there was a less publicized truth. Margaret's hygiene, particularly her oral hygiene, was a consistent source of quiet panic for those within inhaling range. Margaret smoked a lot. Starting in her teens and continuing into her later life, she chain-smoked like it was a constitutional right. Cigarettes weren't just a habit, they were an accessory. A statement. She wielded her long-stemmed holders with theatrical flair, like a Hollywood femme fatale who had misplaced her moral compass in a clutch purse. But where there's smoke, there's, well, breath. And Margaret's, by many accounts, was a blend of nicotine, gin, and defiance. Friends were too polite to mention it to her face, but court staff, hairdressers, and unfortunate florists who got too close with corsage options were less shielded. Her morning routine rarely included brushing her teeth with any rigor, and dental checkups were often skipped either out of royal inertia or a hangover-induced inability to sit upright in a chair that reclined. Over the years, the toll added up. Her teeth yellowed, some decayed. Her breath became a kind of royal rumour, whispered about in Mayfair salons and on the fringes of Buckingham Palace corridors. She masked it, of course, with perfume, with breath mints, with the occasional brandy, but nothing truly worked. She was, as one former aide put it, the sort of woman you adored from across the room and avoided when she leaned in for a whisper. Her hygiene habits overall weren't catastrophic. She bathed, she loved long soaks. In fact, she kept her hair styled, her clothes pristine. But she had a tendency to re-wear things without airing them out, particularly after nights spent drinking and dancing. Her dressing rooms were often filled with perfume and hairspray, a haze of artificial scent layered over something a little more lived in. And her lifestyle certainly didn't help. Late nights, endless cocktails, cigarettes, strong coffee, and very little sleep. It was a recipe for both glamour and gradual decay. The press loved her, but they were kept at a distance. The people who worked with her, however, learned to read the signs. If she entered the room with lipstick perfect, but no gum in hand, it was time to step back. Margaret's decline in later years made matters worse. Health issues mounted. Dental care became less frequent. Her breath, which had once been something people politely ignored, became something they actively tried to escape. One journalist who met her at a late-career charity event described the experience as memorable, if slightly suffocating. Still, she never lost her charisma. People forgave a lot when it came to Margaret. She was bold, funny, and had the rare ability to say the outrageous thing that everyone else was thinking. But in the end, even charisma couldn't mask everything. The royal aura remained. The breath lingered. And then, of course, there was her cousin Edward, Duke of Kent. Less famous, less photographed, but still fully committed to the Windsor tradition of dressing well, waving politely, and smelling, if not exactly bad, then stubbornly unchanged even in a modern world filled with showers, sprays, and every reason to know better. Edward, Duke of Kent. Edward, Duke of Kent, has spent most of his life just outside the spotlight, a familiar silhouette at royal events, always a few rows back from the action. He's the cousin who stood behind the Queen during Trooping the Colour, the stately gentleman who shows up in documentaries with impeccable posture and a faintly confused smile. He was born in 1935, which means he's seen the royal family at its most polished, most dysfunctional, and most fragrant, or, in his case, least. Because for all his medals and formality, the Duke of Kent has, for decades, carried with him a quiet but persistent reputation for odour. Not the dramatic, medieval kind of royal smell. Not a Henry VIII-style stench of wounds and decay. No, Edward's is subtler. It's the scent of someone who never quite got along with soap. A man whose suits are immaculate, whose hair is neatly combed, and whose presence can still make an entire reception hall smell like an unventilated antique shop. It's important to understand that Edward is not a slob. He is, in fact, one of the most dutiful working royals of his generation. He's represented the crown at hundreds of engagements, from military ceremonies to obscure museum openings. He's not flashy, he's not scandalous, he's consistent. But consistency, in this case, has included a long-standing resistance to regular bathing, and a wardrobe that seems to have been hermetically sealed sometime during the Macmillan government. Multiple palace staff have quietly confirmed it over the years. Edward is averse to washing, not because he's unaware of hygiene, but because in his own words he doesn't like to disrupt the body's natural balance. He views frequent showering as excessive, possibly even unnatural. He's said to prefer sponge baths, when absolutely necessary, and to rely mostly on changing his underclothes, though not necessarily daily. And the clothes themselves? Well, they tell their own story. Edward favours a particular style: heavy suits, wool trousers, collared shirts, buttoned high. But many of these garments, while pristine at a distance, are not regularly laundered. Staff members have described his closets as well-preserved but musty. His coats, especially those used for royal engagements, are reportedly worn many times before being dry-cleaned and stored with minimal airing. One valet noted that his overcoat smelled like the inside of a London club that hadn't opened since 1952. He is also fond of cologne, but in a way that suggests he sees it as a replacement, not an enhancement. The cologne is sharp, old-fashioned, and applied liberally, often mixing in unpredictable ways with the fabric of his clothes and the natural oils of someone who hasn't properly scrubbed down in a while. The result is a scent that's been described as vintage upholstery, overheated tweed, and something that smells like it should be wearing medals. The problem is rarely discussed directly. He is, after all, royalty. And royalty, even the slightly musty variety, is treated with deference. At formal events, guests have learned to speak with him respectfully, from a slight angle. Photographers position him thoughtfully. Assistants open windows preemptively. Courtiers deploy discreet sachets of lavender in the corners of his changing rooms. Everyone smiles. Everyone nods. No one brings up the obvious. It's not that he doesn't care about appearances. He absolutely does. His medals are always perfectly aligned. His shoes are polished. His hair, what remains of it, is combed into a perfectly dignified silhouette, but underneath the pageantry is a body that has been left largely to its own devices. His hygiene routine is closer to something out of 1905 than 2025. And the irony is almost poetic. Edward, Duke of Kent, has spent his life standing beside modern monarchs, representing a progressive nation, honouring change, all while carrying with him the olfactory echo of a time when bathing was optional and wool was eternal. He is a relic in motion, not quite of this era, not quite out of it either. He rarely makes headlines. He doesn't cause scandals. He doesn't give interviews. But those who've shared a room with him will remember one thing clearly. Not what he said, not what he did, but how the air shifted when he passed. And so ends the lineage of questionable hygiene, at least for now. The modern royals, raised on photo ops and paparazzi, have traded royal musk for luxury skincare. They bathe, they moisturize, they exfoliate, but they do so standing on a long, unwashed legacy. One that stretches back through woolen trousers and unbrushed teeth, through powdered wigs and chamber pots, through kings who smelled like kitchens and queens who feared the bath. A lineage of crowns and odours. Royalty, after all, is about image, and for much of British history, that image was carefully maintained, artfully constructed, and if you got close enough, surprisingly hard to breathe around.